The clock on the microwave read 1:14 in the morning. Nadia Reyes was on her knees on the kitchen floor, trying to fit pot lids she'd been saving for last into a box she'd gotten from behind the Walgreens on Route 11. And the lids weren't fitting because they never fit, because pot lids were the most irrational objects in any kitchen, and she'd known this for years, and had kept buying mismatched sets anyway, because mismatched sets were cheaper than matched ones. She pressed the biggest lid down on top of the pile and folded the box flaps shut and held them closed with one knee while she tore tape off the dispenser. The sound of the tape pulling off the roll was the loudest thing in the house. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to upstairs. Her children were asleep. Marco was 14 and had gone to bed at midnight after carrying 3 boxes to Rose's borrowed pickup without being asked. Lena was 9 and had cried on Tuesday when Nadia told her they were moving and had not cried since, which was in some ways harder than if she'd kept crying, because Nadia could not fix silence. She had until 6 in the morning. Craig Holloway had put it in writing, his attorney's letterhead with its weight and its careful language, and the meaning underneath the language was simple. Be gone by 6, or the county sheriff's office would assist the process. The legal term was writ of possession. The human term was you no longer live here. She stood up and pushed the box toward the growing stack near the back door. 11 boxes there, 4 more in the hallway, 6 in the living room, and she still had the bathroom closet and the coat hooks, and she was not going to think about the coat hooks yet. Lena's yellow rain slicker was on the second hook from the left. She had been avoiding looking at it for an hour. She checked the count of boxes and thought about what would and wouldn't fit in Rose's pickup and whether she'd need a second trip before 6. She would, but barely. The kitchen smelled like the dried herbs she'd never gotten around to using that had been hanging above the window for 2 years. Eleanor had hung them there, in those specific bundles, in that specific order, and Nadia had left them because touching them felt like taking down something that belonged there. She would take them now. She reached up and pulled the bundles free from their hooks one at a time, the dry stalks crisp in her hands, and set them on top of the box of pots. Then she stood at the window for a moment and looked out at the dark side yard where the garden was, and tried not to think about the 8 months remaining until Lena's sunflowers would come up. 3 years she had been in this house. It had started because she needed to not be on Rosa's couch anymore. The couch was fine. Rosa was more than generous. But it was November and Marco was 11 and Lena was 6, and they were sleeping in Rosa's living room on the pull-out bed that left a bar in the middle of the mattress that Marco kept waking up with a mark from. And Nadia knew every day she stayed was a day. She was also taking from Rosa's family the small private rhythms a household needed to breathe. Rosa's kids were 3 and 5. The apartment had 2 bedrooms. There was no version of this that was anything other than temporary, and Nadia had been there 6 weeks. She'd found the card at the Harwick Public Library on a Thursday afternoon in November. She'd taken the kids there after school because the library was free and had the kind of controlled quiet that children navigated differently from their parents. Marco heading straight for the young adult shelf. Lena trailing her fingers along the spines of picture books she was slightly too old for, but still liked the feel of. The bulletin board at the library was beside the circulation desk, covered in the layered archaeology of posted notices, events and lesson offerings, and lost animals, and the occasional handwritten card from someone trying to sell furniture. Nadia had been reading the notes on the board with the particular attention of someone cataloging options, seeing what she hadn't seen before, not expecting anything specific. The note card was on cream-colored paper, the kind that came in a proper box from a stationery shop rather than in shrink-wrapped bulk from a discount store. The handwriting was careful and small and used no abbreviations. 3-bedroom house, Camber Street. Month to month. $750 per month. No pets. References preferred. $750. She'd done the math in about 4 seconds. One of her jobs, the medical receptionist position at Harwick Medical, paid $28,000 a year. She'd just taken a second job at a cleaning company downtown that would add another $14,000 annually if she worked the hours they were offering. Combined, just over $42,000. $750 a month was $9,000 a year. That was manageable, barely, and with no margin, but manageable. She'd memorized the phone number before taking the card down. She stood at the board and committed it to memory, and then took the card because she couldn't risk someone else getting to it first. Eleanor Vasquez answered on the second ring. Her voice was clear and direct, and contained no particular warmth or its opposite, just information delivered at an appropriate pace by someone who had things to do. She asked 3 questions. Did Nadia have children? Yes. 2. Ages 11 and 6. Did she have employment? 2 positions, medical reception and commercial cleaning. Did she know how to maintain a garden? Nadia looked at the dead geranium on Rose's windowsill that had been dead for 3 months and had never been alive while Nadia lived there. She said she was willing to learn. Eleanor said come Saturday at 2. The house at 114 Camber Street was a 1903 Victorian that had survived a century the way certain things survived, through stubbornness and good original construction, and someone willing to stay attentive to the small failures before they became large ones. The porch wrapped around 3 sides. The boards sound even at the corners where they usually softened first. The paint was old cream with dark green shutters. The green faded to the particular shade that paint reached after enough decades in New Hampshire winters. A garden ran along the south side of the house and wrapped partially around the back, dormant in November, but clearly the project of someone who had spent years understanding what they were doing. Not the garden of someone who planted annuals every May. The garden of someone who had planned for decades. Eleanor was 82 that November. She was small, about 5'2", precisely assembled in the way of women who had learned that bearing communicated more than words. She wore a charcoal cardigan and a brooch at the collar, a small cameo piece that looked like it had been given to her by someone specific, and she shook Nadia's hand at the front door with a grip that was brief and definitive, the kind of handshake that said something about expectations without spelling them out. She walked them through the house. She said the second-floor bathroom faucet ran cold for 90 seconds before warming up. She said the 3rd step from the top of the main staircase squeaked in the center. She said the back door stuck in wet weather and required a shoulder. She described these things not as apologies, but as specifications, the way you briefed someone capable rather than excused yourself to someone you hoped wouldn't notice. The implicit message was clear. The house had small problems. These were the problems. A competent person would manage them. She was finding out if Nadia was a competent person. She showed them the upstairs rooms. 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor and a 4th on the 3rd that she suggested might serve as a study. The ceilings were 9 feet. The windows were old double-hung, all original, all in working order. She showed Marco the study on the 2nd floor that had her late husband's bookshelves, still full, and told him he was welcome to borrow from them if he replaced what he took. Marco looked at the shelves, which ran floor to ceiling on 2 walls, and said he would. Eleanor watched him for a moment, and then said good and moved on. She crouched down to Lena's level, which cost her something visibly, knees that weren't enjoying the November cold, and she shook Lena's hand the same way she'd shaken Nadia's. Formally, person to person. She asked Lena if she liked gardens. Lena said she'd never had one. Eleanor said come spring there would be work if she was interested and explained what that work would involve: soil preparation and seed selection and attention to light, with the precision of someone who did not talk down to children on the grounds of their age. Lena listened with the same seriousness she brought to anything she cared about and said she was interested. The rent had been $750 a month for all 3 years. Eleanor's only explanation, delivered once over tea in her kitchen on Nadia's 2nd Saturday there, was that she'd had the house since 1962 and had paid it off in 1976, and that money beyond what she needed for her purposes was not something she required. She said it as a fact about herself rather than as generosity, which made it easier for Nadia to accept. Eleanor had no patience for gratitude expressed in ways that required responses. Those 3 years had a particular texture to them that Nadia had felt build slowly and had not recognized as something she was counting on until she thought about losing it. Saturday mornings in the garden with Eleanor, who explained soil chemistry the way she explained everything, precisely and without decoration. Eleanor correcting Nadia's pruning technique once in the 1st year, showing her the correct angle without comment, never mentioning it again. The time Lena had asked Eleanor what a specific tool was for, and Eleanor had spent 20 minutes explaining the mechanics of a bulb planter with complete seriousness, treating Lena's question as a real question deserving a real answer. The way Marco had moved through those bookshelves over 3 years, borrowing and returning, occasionally saying at dinner that he'd finished something, sometimes saying what he'd thought of it, Nadia listening for what it told her about who he was becoming. Eleanor had died on a Thursday in August, the 23rd, a week after her 84th birthday. Her housekeeper, a woman named Paula who came twice a week, had found her in the armchair by the south window of her ground-floor living room. The chair faced the garden. The window was open because Eleanor liked the garden smell in August and believed that fresh air was one of the few genuinely curative things in the world. A biography of Willa Cather was open on the side table, face down to save the page. The medical examiner's report said cardiac arrest, no signs of distress, consistent with a peaceful death during or just after sleep. She was 84. Her heart had simply done its last thing. Nadia had cried in the parking lot of Harwick Medical the day she heard. She'd sat in her car for 12 minutes and then gone back inside because she had 3 patients waiting at the reception desk. She hadn't cried since, because Eleanor would have considered ongoing grief an investment of time in something that couldn't be changed when there were things that could be changed demanding that attention. Nadia had understood this about Eleanor without Eleanor having to say it, which was true of most of what she understood about her. Craig. Holloway had knocked on the tenant door, the upper door, the door Eleanor had always treated as Nadia's space rather than an entrance to her own house, 11 days after the funeral. 11 days. Nadia had opened it to find him already checking his phone, which suggested he'd been doing that the whole time he'd been waiting. He introduced himself as Eleanor's nephew, Harold's family, and put his hand out without fully looking up. She shook it. He was around 50, well-maintained, the kind of man who spent money on himself without appearing to think about it. His jacket fit too well to have come off a rack. He had light gray eyes that moved with a particular quality, the quality of someone calculating square footage rather than looking at a room. He explained that he'd inherited the property as Eleanor's surviving family member and was evaluating his options. He used the word options with what appeared to be genuine pleasure in the category of decisions that implied. Nadia said she had a month-to-month tenancy. He said yes, he was aware of that, and of the terms, which he'd discussed with his attorney. He was prepared to honor the legal notice period required by New Hampshire statute. He added that the rent she was paying was considerably below market rate, and that this situation would not continue. He said all of this evenly, pleasantly, in the manner of someone describing the operation of a mechanism rather than a decision he was making about her life. Not unkind, exactly, just categorically uninterested in her as a person. He'd left his card. Holloway Property Services, Boston. She'd found out from Adiz Okafor, the neighbor at 118 Camber Street who had known Eleanor for 41 years, that Craig had also visited the property assessor's office on the same day he'd visited Nadia, and had called a real estate attorney in Manchester that same week, and had met with someone from a development firm called Hadley Group within the first month of Eleanor's death. The Hadley Group, according to what Adiz's daughter had found when she looked it up, specialized in what their website called residential development of legacy properties in New England communities, which meant Victorian houses in small towns, which meant this house. Pamela Durst from Hadley Group had knocked on Nadia's door in October, a woman about 40 with the professional manner of someone paid to be persuasive and thorough in equal measure. She'd been friendly in the focused way of someone whose friendliness was a tool. She had information about the projected timeline for the property and wanted to make sure Nadia was aware of her rights and resources. She wanted to make sure Nadia knew there were relocation assistance programs that Hadley Group made available to tenants in situations like this one. She said the phrase situations like this one with a practiced gentleness that suggested it was part of a prepared text. Nadia had said thank you and closed the door. The first formal eviction notice had come 9 days after Pamela Durst's visit through Craig's attorney's office. 30 days to vacate. Nadia's own attorney, a woman named Christine Daly who handled tenant law in Harwick and charged fees that represented the outer edge of what Nadia could afford, had asked for 60 on the grounds that 30 days was insufficient for a family with school-age children. Craig had granted 60. Christine had asked for one more extension through the holidays, with a Christmas morning eviction carrying optics that Craig's attorney apparently found unappealing. Craig had granted through January 14th at 6 a.m. tonight. Christine had told her, honestly, that the legal basis for staying further was thin without an ownership claim. The month-to-month tenancy was legal. Craig was the heir of record, and Eleanor's estate had gone through probate without any challenge to Craig's claim. There was no fixed-term lease to protect her. Christine had also told her, separately and quietly, that if there was anything in Eleanor's personal papers that Nadia should have been shown and hadn't been, this would be the time to look. Christine had said it once and not repeated it, but she'd meant it seriously, and Nadia had understood that she meant it seriously. She hadn't found anything, or thought she hadn't. She'd looked through the things Eleanor had kept in her upstairs office, the space Eleanor had used for correspondence and record-keeping, accessible through the shared hallway. Insurance papers, receipts, a folder of medical records organized by year. Nothing about a will. Nothing unexpected. She had thought about the basement once. She'd discarded the thought because the basement was ordinary. She'd been down there plenty of times. There was nothing there. She had been wrong about that. Her financial situation had a particular arithmetic she'd run in her head, so often the numbers came without effort. Annual income, $42,300 pre-tax. Monthly take-home after tax and the children's health insurance through Harwick Medical, $2,900. Monthly expenses in the house on Camber Street. Rent $750. Utilities averaging $220. Food approximately $600. Car insurance $94. Gas $130. Marco's school-related costs about $80 per month averaged across the year. Lena's after-school program $160. Phone $45. That left approximately $820 for everything else, including any bill that arrived unexpected, which they always did, and the minimum payments on the $7,400 of credit card debt she'd carried since the divorce. Dario's attorney had somehow managed to make her responsible for half of the joint accounts when the accounts had been in both their names for years in a marriage where she'd thought that meant something. She'd been paying the minimum on the cards, which meant the balance moved sideways like a slow tide. The apartment in Millhaven had a monthly rent of $890. $140 more per month than what she was paying now. She'd worked the math every way she could, and it came to the same number each time. Thin. Manageable if nothing broke. Not manageable if anything broke. Her car had 112,000 miles on it. Cars broke. Marco's track coach had told her at the last parent night that Marco had real capability if he kept at it, that he had this spring in mind for him specifically. The school in Millhaven had a track program. She'd checked. It wasn't the same coach. Lena had planted a row of sunflowers last summer along the south fence, the way Eleanor had shown her the spring before she died. She'd planted them from seed, pressing each one into the soil with a deliberation that made Nadia's chest tight to watch. They would bloom in someone else's garden this August. She stopped thinking about those things and went back to packing. Marco had come down at 8 that evening and carried boxes without being asked. He'd moved efficiently, making 3 trips to the truck, not talking much. The silence of someone who understood that work was more useful than commentary right now. He was 14 and had his father's height, but nothing else that Nadia could identify as Dario's, the rest of it appearing to come from somewhere that wasn't either of them, some earlier version of the family that had deposited patience and an interest in books into the line, and then waited for Marco to express it. He'd carried the boxes with the focus of someone doing a thing he needed to do, and at 11:45 he'd said he was going to bed, and she'd said okay, and he'd stood there for a second. He'd said, "You're going to be up all night, aren't you?" She'd said, "I'll sleep in the new place." He'd understood this was not an answer to his question and had not pushed it. He'd gone upstairs and the house had gotten quieter. Lena had been impossible to put to bed earlier. Not crying, just present, needing to be in whatever room Nadia was in, asking questions that were mostly not about the move but about other things. Whether sunflowers in a new place would look different from sunflowers in the old place. Whether she could bring the garden trowel Eleanor had given her last spring. Whether the new apartment had a window that faced the right direction. Nadia had answered each question without impatience, which had cost her something, and at 9:30 had finally gotten Lena into bed with the trowel under her pillow because Lena had specifically requested it there. The coat hooks in the hallway held the yellow rain slicker and both coats and Marco's track jacket. She had been walking past them for 3 hours without touching them. She knew that the moment she took down the slicker and folded it into a box, the house would become an empty building. It would stop being where they lived. The coat hooks were the last thing, and she was not ready for the last thing yet. She went to the basement instead. She told herself it was for the box of books she'd moved down there 2 weeks ago and hadn't brought back up. The books needed to go in the truck. That was the reason. She flipped the light switch at the top of the stairs and went down. The basement was what it had always been. Fieldstone foundation on 3 walls, the gray painted concrete floor, the furnace ticking in the far corner, the single bulb overhead making shadows along the base of the walls. The tool shelf near the water heater. The shelves with mason jars for canning. Everything labeled in Eleanor's hand on strips of masking tape, the writing small and deliberate. The box of books was where she'd left it against the far wall. She bent her knees to lift it rather than her back, a habit from 2 weeks of carrying boxes, and the box was heavier than she remembered. She carried it to the bottom of the stairs and set it down on the last step. Then she stood there. She was not sure why she stood there. The bathroom closet was waiting upstairs. The coat hooks were waiting. She had 4 hours and she had things to do. She looked at the south wall. 3 walls of the basement were stone foundation, the original fieldstone laid in the early 1900s, rough and irregular and permanent. The south wall was different. Someone had put up wood paneling sometime in the 60s or 70s, the faux-grain composite kind, dark walnut color, applied in 4x8 sheets and running the full length of the wall from floor to ceiling. At the east end of that wall, a built-in bookcase occupied maybe 6 feet of it, floor to ceiling, same dark wood. It held mason jars on the lower shelves and paint cans on the upper ones. Nadia had looked at it dozens of times over 3 years. She had never thought much about it. She stood and looked at it again. It bothered her in a way she couldn't name. Not the bookcase itself, which was ordinary, but something about the wall and the bookcase together. The proportion was off somehow. She was not a carpenter and had no particular trained eye for construction, but she'd spent enough time in this basement to know the ordinary dimensions of things, and the bookcase was thicker than it needed to be for what it held. The depth of it, front to back, was greater than the depth of the mason jars by at least 8 inches. She crossed to it. She looked at the floor in front of it. The concrete floor at the base of the bookcase had a mark in it. A curved mark, faint, a quarter-arc shape starting at the left edge of the bookcase base and sweeping outward about 18 inches before disappearing under the shelf unit. She'd seen it before, in the way you saw things without registering them, the brain filing it as irrelevant without presenting it for examination. Now she looked at it directly. That was the kind of mark a swinging door, left on concrete when it was opened and dragged slightly along the floor. She put both hands flat against the right side of the bookcase and pushed. Nothing moved. She tried the left side. Still nothing. She looked at the shelves more carefully. The mason jars on the lower shelves were sitting on boards with small notches on the front edge where they'd been fitted in, adjustable shelving. The upper shelf with the paint cans was different. The board was slightly newer, slightly brighter, and it sat in a fixed position rather than on adjustable pins. She reached up and pressed it. The click was small, mechanical, the precise sound of a spring-loaded latch releasing inside the wall. It was quiet enough that she might have missed it if the house weren't completely silent. The bookcase moved. It swung toward her on hinges set into the east side of the frame, pivoting smoothly outward. No dragging. No protest. No grinding resistance. The hinges had been maintained, oiled over years, opened regularly enough that they held their function. The quarter-arc scratch on the floor was from an earlier iteration, before someone had adjusted the alignment. Behind the bookcase was a door. Not a seam in the paneling, not a hidden panel. A door. A proper wooden door with a round brass knob and a keyhole below it. The door was the same dark wood as the surrounding paneling and had been installed flush enough that the seam was invisible until you knew to look for it. The brass knob was tarnished to a warm brown. The keyhole held no key. She turned the knob. It was unlocked. The door swung inward on well-maintained hinges. The air that came out was dry and cool in a way that was distinct from the ordinary basement air, which ran damp in the warmer months and merely cool in winter. This was the regulated dryness of a space that had been intentionally controlled, that had had consistent temperature and humidity maintained over many years. The smell was specific. Old paper and wood and something underneath. A mineral note she couldn't immediately place. She needed her phone for the light. She went upstairs to get it. She came back down in under 2 minutes, moving faster than she had all night. She turned the flashlight on and stepped through the door. The room was 12 feet by 14 feet, which was larger than she'd expected from the outside of the bookcase. The ceiling was 7 feet, finished with tongue-and-groove wood planking, the narrow strips fitted tight and sanded smooth. The walls were plaster, painted white, the paint old and matte but intact, no water stains, no cracks. The floor was wide plank wood, fitted over the concrete, and finished with something that had aged to a dull honey color. Someone had built this room inside the basement's footprint and lined it with insulation visible along the seam where the walls met the floor. A small dehumidifier sat in the corner near the door, unplugged now, probably unplugged since August. But the room didn't smell damp because it had been kept dry long enough that the air held stable. The work had been done carefully and maintained for a long time. Along the left wall, 3 wooden shelves ran the length of the room, floor to ceiling. On the shelves were flat wooden cases, stacked in rows of 2 or 3, each one a different size, but none larger than about 16 inches by 12. She counted them by moving the flashlight beam slowly along the rows. 22 cases. Each one had a small brass latch on the front. The cases were cherry wood, polished, showing the slight irregularity of finish that came from being done by hand over years rather than manufactured in quantity. Along the right wall, 2 gray metal filing cabinets stood side by side. The older style, heavy steel, with deep drawers and round drawer pulls, the kind made to last 4 decades and used for 5. The drawers showed the slight patina of frequent handling along the pull areas, the paint worn through to bare metal at the touch points. At the back of the room, a writing desk. Dark wood, probably the same period as the shelves. On the desk, a green banker's lamp with a brass base, its cord tucked neatly behind it and unplugged. A small wooden tray with a pen still in it, dried but uncapped, as though someone had used it recently and set it down. And on the desk's surface, in the exact center, a white envelope. The envelope had her name on it. Nadia Reyes, written in Eleanor's handwriting. The same small, careful script as the note card on the library bulletin board 3 years ago. No address, no other information. Just the name. She stood in the doorway with the flashlight and looked at the envelope and understood several things at once. The way comprehension sometimes arrived not in sequence, but all together. Craig's 11-day timeline after the funeral. His attorney's filing speed. The eviction notices that came faster than legally required and had to be slowed by requests for extensions. Pamela Durst visiting in October to offer relocation assistance before anyone had told Nadia she needed to be relocated. The way every part of Craig's approach had been designed to move her out of this house before she had time to do anything except react. He knew this room existed. He did not know where it was. And he knew that as long as Nadia was in the house, she might find it before he did. She crossed to the desk and picked up the envelope. The flap was sealed, pressed flat, no tape. She opened it carefully and removed 2 sheets of folded cream note card paper. She unfolded them and moved the flashlight so the beam fell across the text. Nadia, I assume you found this because Craig has done what I knew he would do, which is to try to remove you from this house before you could find what I am leaving you here. I am sorry for the position this puts you in. There are several things I want you to understand before you do anything else. This room contains approximately $1.4 million in assets. I am leaving it to you. Nadia read those 2 sentences 4 times, counting without meaning to count. $1.4 million. In this room. In a house on Camber Street in Harwick, New Hampshire, at 1:48 in the morning on a Wednesday in January. She sat down on the floor because standing no longer seemed necessary. The letter continued. Eleanor's handwriting did not waver. It had the quality of something written in full command of what needed to be said, not rushed, not uncertain. No throat clearing. No apologies. Just Eleanor. I have been collecting for 60 years. You may have noticed that I lived simply and did not appear to worry about money. The reason is that I managed it carefully for a long time, and this room is the result. Harold knew the room existed. He helped me build it in 1969. The room does not appear on any architectural record. Harold died in 2007 without telling Craig about it, which was a decision we made together. Harold did not trust Craig with significant information, and time did not prove that judgment wrong. The cases on the left wall hold coins. I have been collecting American coinage since 1964. The collection contains 47 St. Gaudens double eagle gold coins, the $20 gold pieces minted between 1900 and 1933. 6 of these are in particularly good condition and carry premium value above the standard gold price. The collection also contains Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half dollars, and 3-seated Liberty coins from the 1800s that carry significant numismatic value beyond their metal content. The most recent independent appraisal I commissioned was conducted 18 months ago by Dr. Ruth Salter at the Concord Numismatic Society. The total appraised value at that time was $640,000. I have kept the collection in stable conditions, and the market for such pieces does not typically decline. The last 6 cases on the right end of the bottom shelf contain bearer bonds. I purchased these between 1972 and 1989. Total face value is $240,000. Accrued interest documentation is in the right filing cabinet. In the bottom drawer of the left filing cabinet, you will find my will dated September 14th of this year, signed and witnessed. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. This supersedes any prior document Craig may produce. Craig has a copy of my 1994 will, which I revoked when Harold died in 2007. I do not know with certainty how he obtained it or whether the copy he has is the original or a reproduction. James Okafor, my attorney, has a copy of the September will and has been preparing for this situation. His number is inside the right filing cabinet in the first folder in the top drawer. The September will leaves you this house and all its contents. Nadia set the letter down on the desk for a moment. She looked at the cases on the shelves. 22 of them, cherry wood and brass latches, stacked in their careful rows. She looked at the filing cabinets. She looked at the green banker's lamp and the tray with the uncapped pen and the square of desk surface where the letter had been sitting, waiting, since December. She picked the letter back up. I want to say something that has nothing to do with the money or the legal situation, because those things James can handle and money is only money at the end of things. I had a daughter. Her name was Anna. She was born in 1963 and she died in February of 1981 on the highway outside Concord, in a car, in snow, at 17 years old. Harold and I never had other children. I never spoke of Anna to people who came after that time, because what Anna was to me was not something I could make comprehensible in a conversation, and I had no interest in trying. But I want you to know her name, and that she existed, and that she was the reason I knew how to watch a child become a person. She was the reason I understood what that cost a parent, the watching and the hoping and the daily work of it. Your son Marco borrowed 47 books from Harold's shelves in 3 years and returned each one to where it belonged. I counted. He read them. He did not borrow them as a performance of being the kind of boy who borrowed books. He actually read them. I know this because when I asked him once, in passing, what he thought of a particular one, he had a specific answer that only came from having read it and thought about it afterward. Your daughter Lena planted sunflowers last summer along the south fence and paid attention to where the light fell in the morning. She paid attention in the way gardeners pay attention, not as a task, but as a practice. I showed her once how to read the light on that section of fence, and she adapted what I showed her and made it better suited to the specific spot she had chosen. That is not something I taught her. That was already in her. You asked me what I needed, and then you did it. You never made the asking a performance of care. You just asked and then did what you said you'd do. This is rarer than you think. I chose you to have this house and what is in this room because you are the right person to have it. I am aware that this will create difficulties with Craig and with the legal machinery generally. I am also aware that I am 84 years old and have been watching a family become something in this house for 3 years, and I am not interested in allowing Craig Holloway to take that apart, because he arrived 11 days after my funeral with his attorney's number already dialed. Do not leave the house. I am telling you this specifically. If Craig has given you a deadline, the act of remaining becomes relevant in ways James will explain. But beyond any legal relevance, I am telling you not to leave because this is your house. It has been your house for 3 years, and the fact that the paperwork did not say so until now does not change what is true. Do not leave the house. The letter was signed in Eleanor's hand, small and definitive. The date below the signature was December 18th, 3 weeks before Eleanor died. 3 weeks before the heart that had decided Eleanor Vasquez's terms for 84 years had quietly done its last thing in a chair facing the garden she'd kept for 60 years. Nadia sat in the hidden room at 1:56 in the morning with the flashlight in her hand and Eleanor's letter on the desk and read the last 4 paragraphs a second time. Then she sat there for a while longer without reading anything. She thought about Anna, who had been 17 in 1981 on a February highway, and who Eleanor had not spoken of to anyone for 40 years after. She thought about Harold, who had helped build this room in 1969 and had spent the rest of his life not telling Craig about it. She thought about 47 double eagle gold coins in cherrywood cases on a shelf 5 feet away. She thought about Eleanor's specific observations about Marco's 47 books and Lena's sunflowers, and what it meant that a woman who did not say things without reason had said them in a letter she wrote knowing she would not be there to follow up. She thought about Craig Holloway's attorney's letterhead and the deadline written on it in language that expected her to comply because people in her position always complied. Do not leave the house. She stood up. Her legs were stiff from the concrete floor. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her back pocket. She picked up the flashlight and looked around the room one more time. The shelves and the cabinets and the desk with the lamp, the whole of it built and maintained for 50 years by 2 people who had understood that some things were worth protecting. She went back through the door into the main basement. She pushed the bookcase back into its position until the latch clicked. She stood in the ordinary basement for a moment with the furnace ticking in the corner and looked at the south wall, which looked exactly as it always had, and then she went upstairs. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table that she had been about to pack and carry to Mill Haven, and she drank the coffee in the quiet of the house while her children slept above her and the boxes stood stacked near the doors, and the clock on the microwave moved through 2 and then through 2:30. At 2:41 she went back downstairs, back through the bookcase door, and found the right filing cabinet and the first folder in the first drawer. The paper inside had James Okafor's name at the top and his number, and beside the number, in parentheses, the notation call regardless of time. She came back upstairs and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the number for about 30 seconds. She called. He answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was clear and alert, the voice of a man who had been waiting for this call, or at least not surprised by it. He said his name. She gave hers. There was a brief silence, maybe 2 seconds, the length of time it took for relief to register in a person who had been holding something in readiness for 6 months. He said he'd been waiting to hear from her for 6 months. She said she had until 6 a.m. and was not going to leave. He said good. He said stay there. He said not to answer the door if Craig arrived before 5:30, and if Craig arrived before 5:30, to say through the door that she had legal representation present and had nothing further to say to him or his representatives. James said he would be at the house himself by 5:30. She said she understood. He said one more thing before he ended the call. He said Eleanor had been very specific about you, and he said it with the particular emphasis of someone conveying information that was also a form of reassurance, as though being specifically thought of was its own category of protection. She didn't ask him what he meant. She thought she already knew. She sat at the table for another hour, drinking the coffee and looking at the kitchen she had been in the process of dismantling and was now in the process of reconsidering. The boxes, the bear counters, the dried herb bundles sitting on top of the pot box that she had taken down and would put back. At 3:56, she heard Marco's door open. His steps on the stairs were quiet, but not quiet enough. The 3rd step from the top giving its note under his foot, which she heard not as something to fix, but as something familiar, a particular sound from a particular house that she knew the way you knew sounds from places where you had lived long enough for them to become part of what home meant. He came into the kitchen in his socks and his track sweatshirt, the school name across the chest in letters that had faded slightly from washing. He looked at her with eyes that were fully awake. He had not quite been asleep. He said, "Mom." She said, "Sit down." He sat. She told him everything she'd found, in the order she'd found it. The basement, the bookcase, the door, the room, the cases and the filing cabinets, and the banker's lamp. Eleanor's letter, the coins worth $640,000, and the bonds, and the will that said the house belonged to Nadia. She told him about James Okafor and the phone call. She told him James was coming at 5:30. Marco listened the way he listened to things that mattered, without interruption, without the small, restless movements that people made when they were waiting for someone to finish. He sat with his hands on the table, and he listened. When she stopped talking, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The sunflowers." She said, "What?" He said, "Eleanor wrote about Lena's sunflowers. Lena is going to absolutely lose her mind when she finds out Eleanor noticed that." Nadia laughed. It was a short sound, sharp and startled, and when it was done the kitchen felt slightly lighter, the way kitchens felt when someone laughed in them in the middle of the night when they had no particular business laughing. She looked at her son and he looked at her, and outside the window above the kitchen sink, above the dark side yard where the garden was, above the south fence where Lena's sunflowers were sleeping in the frozen ground, the sky was still fully dark. But in the east, past the roofline of the Okafor house next door, past the bare branches of the maple on the corner, something had begun to change in the quality of the darkness. The black had taken on depth to it, the first quiet suggestion of the blue that came before gray, the gray that came before dawn. There were 2 hours and 14 minutes until 6 a.m. Nadia Reyes was not going anywhere. James Okafor arrived at 5:28 in the morning, which was 2 minutes before he'd said he would arrive. He drove a gray Volvo that had seen better years and parked it carefully parallel to the curb with the precision of someone who did small things correctly out of habit rather than occasion. He was 67 years old, slight, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular posture of a man who had spent 4 decades in a profession that rewarded carefulness and had been careful ever since. He wore a navy overcoat over a dark suit that had been pressed, which meant he had either not slept or had dressed before attempting to. He carried a briefcase that was not new. Nadia had the door open before he reached the porch steps. He came in without preamble. He shook her hand, shook Marco's hand with the same formality, looked at the boxes stacked near the doors for only a moment before looking away from them the way you looked away from something you intended to help correct. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the briefcase and set out 3 folders and then looked at her. He said, "Walk me through exactly what you found and in what order." She did. Marco sat beside her and didn't interrupt. When she finished, James was quiet for a moment, looking at the folders on the table. Then he said, "The September will supersedes the 94 document. Eleanor's mental competency at the time of signing is documented by 2 witnesses whose identities and professions will matter. I have signed affidavits from both. Craig will contest capacity. That's the expected avenue, given he has no other legitimate claim. The contest will be filed in probate court within the next 2 weeks." He said it with the flatness of someone who had anticipated this for 6 months and found the anticipation confirmed. Not alarmed, not particularly worried, just noting what was going to happen. He said, "The most important thing right now is that you remain in the house. Possession matters in property disputes in ways that are sometimes frustrating but are real. You are the named beneficiary of the valid and current will. You are in residence. That is a position I can work with." He put a document on the table. "This is a notice to Craig Holloway and his attorney that you are represented by counsel, that you dispute the claim of tenancy termination based on the existence of a subsequent will, and that any attempt to remove you or access the property without court order will be contested." I'll give him a copy this morning. Craig arrived at 5:46, 14 minutes ahead of his 6 a.m. deadline, which was the move of someone who wanted to demonstrate control over the timeline. He had his attorney with him, a man in his 40s named Garrett Cole who carried his own briefcase and had the look of someone being paid adequately to be present at uncomfortable hours. They pulled up in Craig's rental car, black and large, and Craig was out the door before it stopped rolling completely. Nadia stayed inside. James went to the door. She heard the conversation through the front door without being able to see it. Craig's voice, initially comfortable, the voice of someone arriving to confirm an expected outcome. Then a pause. Then the register changing, not loud, not yet, but different, The way voices changed when a calculation had been incorrect and the person was still deciding how to respond to that. James's voice was even throughout. She heard him use the phrase current and valid will. She heard him use the phrase counsel of record. She heard Craig's attorney say something specific and James respond with the name of the probate court and a case number he apparently had memorized. There was a longer silence. Then Craig said something she couldn't make out, short and sharp, and his attorney said something that included the word challenge, and then the sound of them walking back to the car. The car doors closed. The engine started. The car didn't leave immediately. It sat at the curb for about 3 minutes, which she assumed was Craig on the phone. Then it left. Marco, who had been standing beside her in the hallway, said, "Is it over?" James came back inside and closed the front door and looked at Marco with the expression of a man calibrating how much to simplify his answer for a 14-year-old before deciding not to simplify it at all. "It is not over. It has begun." He sat back down at the table. He explained what would happen next with the methodical clarity of someone who had walked people through difficult processes enough times to know which details mattered and which ones produced fear without usefulness. Craig would file a will contest in Hillsborough County Probate Court, almost certainly within 2 weeks. He would claim that Eleanor lacked testamentary capacity when she signed the September document. He would present the 1994 will as the valid expression of her wishes. He would also, James expected, make certain characterizations about Nadia's relationship with Eleanor and whether undue influence had been involved in the September will's creation. That last one is the ugliest strategy and also the most common, James said. He will suggest, with documents and witnesses he'll work to assemble, that you manipulated an elderly woman. Nadia sat with this for a moment. The kitchen was gray with the early light that came through the window over the sink, the particular flat light of a January morning in New Hampshire when the sun arrived reluctantly and without warmth. She could hear the furnace clicking on below them. How do we respond to that? With Eleanor. James tapped the folder on his left. The video deposition she made 6 weeks before the September will was signed. 40 minutes of Eleanor being entirely and demonstrably Eleanor. Her verbal recall, her reasoning, her specific articulation of why she made the choices she made. There is no version of Eleanor in that video that a reasonable person could characterize as diminished. He paused. She made the video specifically for this moment. She anticipated Craig's strategy precisely. Marco said, quietly, "She thought of everything." "She was an extremely organized person," James said. "I represented her for 31 years. I have never had a client who prepared more thoroughly for the things she expected to happen." Lena woke up at 7:15, which was late for her. She came downstairs in the oversized flannel pajamas she'd been given for Christmas, still half asleep, and found her mother and her brother and a man she didn't recognize sitting at the kitchen table drinking coffee. She stopped in the doorway and looked at the boxes still stacked near the back door. She said, "Did we not move?" Nadia said, "Come sit down." Lena sat. Nadia told her what had happened, or the version of it that translated to 9 years old without losing the essential truth. The hidden room, Eleanor's letter, the will, the fact that the house was theirs. Lena listened with the particular stillness she brought to important things. When Nadia got to the part about Eleanor's letter and what Eleanor had written about the sunflowers, Lena's expression shifted in a way that was hard to describe precisely. Not crying, not yet. Something prior to crying. The moment when a feeling arrived that was larger than the space available for it. She said, "Eleanor wrote about my sunflowers? Specifically, that you paid attention to where the light fell in the morning." Lena looked at the window for a moment. Then she said, "Can I go outside?" Nadia said yes. They watched her through the kitchen window, this 9-year-old in flannel pajamas and no coat, crossing the side yard in the January cold toward the south fence. She stopped in front of the section where she'd planted the seeds last August, the bare soil frozen and gray under the winter sky. She stood there looking at it for a long time, arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and Nadia could not see her face from the window, but understood anyway what was happening. Marco said, "Someone should bring her a coat." He went outside with her coat, and she let him put it around her shoulders without turning around, still looking at the fence. James Okafor watched this through the window, and then looked back at his folder. He said, "I should tell you about the witnesses to the September will." The witnesses were Paula Hennessy, Eleanor's housekeeper, who had worked for her for 9 years and who James described as both credible and observant in ways that would hold up in court, and Dr. Miriam Cho, Eleanor's physician of 12 years, who had seen Eleanor 3 weeks before the signing and whose notes from that visit documented a woman in full and complete cognitive function. Dr. Cho had agreed in writing to testify if needed. She had signed the affidavit, James said, without hesitation and before he'd finished explaining why he was asking. He left at 9 in the morning with a plan and a timeline and a list of things he needed from Nadia over the next 2 weeks. Records of her tenancy, the rent payment history, any written communication she'd had with Eleanor over 3 years, cards or notes, of which she had several. Eleanor's neat handwriting on the backs of seed packets recommending spacing for the tomatoes. A brief note from the second spring saying the flocks along the north bed needed cutting back by a third. Small things. Specific things. The kind of evidence that built a portrait of a relationship that was genuine rather than calculated. Nadia walked James to his car and shook his hand in the cold morning air. He said, "Eleanor chose you because you were the right person. The court will understand that eventually. My job is to make eventually happen quickly." She watched his gray Volvo pull away and stood on the porch for a moment before going back inside, looking at the January street, the bare trees, the Okafor house next door with its lights on in the kitchen, smoke from somebody's chimney 3 houses down bending in the wind. The ordinary morning of an ordinary street that was not going to be ordinary for a while. 3 days later, Craig filed the contest. The paperwork arrived through his attorney, delivered to Christine Daly's office rather than to the house, because James had instructed Craig's team to direct all correspondence through legal channels, and they had complied with that instruction at least. Christine called Nadia at the reception desk during her 11 o'clock break and read her the relevant sections. Craig Holloway versus Vasquez estate cited 3 grounds. First, that Eleanor had lacked testamentary capacity at the time of the September signing, supported by a letter from a physician Craig had apparently located who had seen Eleanor once at a walk-in clinic in October of the previous year for a sinus infection. Second, that the September will had been obtained through undue influence by Nadia Reyes, who as a live-in tenant had been in a position to manipulate an elderly and isolated woman. Third, that Craig Holloway as Eleanor's surviving next of kin had a prior claim established by the 1994 will, which had never been legally revoked. Christine read these points steadily and without editorial. When she finished, Nadia was quiet for a moment. She said, "Live-in tenant." Christine said, "Yes. He's characterizing the relationship as one of dependency. Eleanor depending on you. She never depended on me for anything except occasionally knowing when the pharmacy was open." "I know. James knows. We'll document that." The undue influence claim had a specific texture to it that Nadia found, in a way she hadn't expected, more painful than the practical threat. It took 3 years of genuine care and described them as strategy. It took the Saturday mornings in the garden and the borrowed books and the trowel Eleanor had given Lena and converted them into evidence of manipulation. It made Eleanor small. It made her someone who could be worked on and taken advantage of by a tenant with an agenda. Eleanor, who had shaken Lena's hand with the same firm grip she gave adults. Eleanor, who had decided on Nadia's rent without asking for input and had not changed it for 3 years, not because she'd been talked into anything, but because she'd made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. She said to Christine, "He's going to lose." Christine said, "Yes, but it will take time and it will cost money." Pamela Durst called Nadia's cell phone on a Thursday, 10 days after Craig filed. She called at 7 in the morning, which was either oversight or a choice, and when Nadia picked up she identified herself pleasantly and said she was calling as a courtesy. Hadley Group, she explained, had been operating on a timeline. There were permits that had been applied for, architectural plans that had been commissioned, financing arrangements that were time-sensitive. She understood the situation had become complicated. She wanted Nadia to know that Hadley Group remained interested in the property and that if the legal situation were to resolve in Nadia's favor, they would be happy to discuss purchase terms that reflected that. Nadia said, "What were you planning to build?" A brief pause. Then Pamela said that the plans had called for 6 residential units on the footprint of the current structure, with additional units in a new building at the rear of the lot. Market rate housing in a neighborhood that would benefit from increased density. Nadia said, "The house wasn't going to be part of the development." The house would have been demolished, yes. 1903 construction doesn't typically meet current code requirements cost-effectively. 6 residential units where the house stood. A new building where the garden was. 60 years of Eleanor's careful living, converted into market-rate square footage. Nadia said, "Thank you for calling." She hung up and went to the window and looked at the garden for a long time. Adiz Okafor came over on a Saturday morning with a tin of almond cookies her daughter had made in the manner of someone who had been waiting for permission to come and had decided the circumstances now constituted permission. She was 69, a retired nurse with the particular energy of someone whose profession had trained her to read situations quickly and respond to what was actually needed rather than what was asked for. She had known Eleanor for 41 years. She'd known Harold. She sat at Nadia's kitchen table and ate one cookie and offered the rest, and told Nadia things about Eleanor that the files in the hidden room would confirm, but that Nadia didn't know yet. Eleanor had been an art dealer. Not the Harwick version of an art dealer. Not someone who ran a small gallery on the main street selling local landscapes to summer people. Eleanor had worked from the 1960s through the 80s with galleries in Boston and New York, specializing in American folk art and decorative arts from the colonial period through the early 20th century. She'd had a particular eye for functional objects made with artistic intention, weather vanes and painted furniture and textiles, and she'd spent 20 years buying early and selling to museums and serious collectors before the market caught up to her judgment. She'd stopped dealing in the mid-80s, Adiz said. She'd stopped because Harold's health had become complicated and because she was tired of the city and because she'd made enough money by then that stopping was possible. She'd come back to Harwick, to the house she and Harold had lived in since 1962, and she had stayed. The coins had come from a collector's instinct that never fully rested, Adiz said. Eleanor had told her once, many years ago, that she bought coins the way other people bought insurance, steady and patient, and with the understanding that the value was in the holding rather than the selling. Did she ever talk about having children? Nadia asked. Adiz was quiet for a moment. She mentioned Anna once to me. Only once, and a long time ago. We had been talking about the neighborhood children, about how the street had changed. She said she'd had a daughter who would have been the right age to know the children next door. Adiz looked at the cookie tin. She didn't say anything more than that, and I understood not to ask. She wrote about her. In the letter she left me. Did she? Her name, and what year she was born, and what year she died, and that she was the reason Eleanor knew how to watch children become people. Adiz was quiet again for a longer moment. That sounds like Eleanor exactly. Nadia spent her evenings in the hidden room after the children were in bed. She'd run an extension cord from the outlet nearest the bookcase door down to the banker's lamp on the desk, and the green shade threw a focused pool of warm light across the desk surface and made the room feel less like a vault and more like a place where someone had worked. She brought tea in a mug and sat at the desk and worked through the filing cabinets folder by folder, not rushing, giving each document what it needed. The right filing cabinet held Eleanor's coin purchase records. The first folder contained receipts going back to 1964, the first year, a single purchase of a Morgan silver dollar from a dealer in Boston for $11. $11 for a coin that would be worth several hundred today. Eleanor had written in the margin of the receipt, in the handwriting that was already recognizable even in its younger version, the mint date, a condition note, one sentence of acquisition reasoning. Good bones. The subsequent years built slowly. A few purchases a year through the 60s. More in the 70s as her dealing career had generated income, she was converting into the kind of holding that didn't move through ordinary financial channels. The Double Eagle purchases began in 1969, the same year the hidden room was built, the same year Harold had helped her create a space for things she intended to keep private for a long time. She'd bought them from 4 different dealers over 20 years, spreading the purchases so no single transaction was large enough to be memorable. The prices she'd paid in the 1960s and 70s for coins that now appraised at several $1,000s each told the full story of patient accumulation. One Double Eagle purchased in 1971 for $280. Another in 1973 for $315. 47 purchases across 2 decades, each documented with the same meticulous notation, each one an act of confidence in the long view over the short one. Nadia spent a Tuesday evening opening the coin cases one by one. The first case held 6 Morgan silver dollars in individual plastic sleeves, each labeled in Eleanor's hand with mint date and mint mark and condition grade written in pencil on an archival label. The coins were the color of old pewter, the designs clear and high relief, Lady Liberty's profile distinct and clean. She held one up under the lamp and turned it and felt the weight of it, which was substantial for its size, the heft of actual silver in quantity rather than silver as a surface treatment. The double eagle case was the 6th one on the shelf. She unlatched it and lifted the lid. The coins were nested in formed velvet cutouts, each one in its own depression. The velvet faded from deep burgundy to a pale wine color at the surface where light had touched it over decades. The coins were the size of $half, a warm golden color that was not the bright yellow of gold jewelry, but the deeper tone of high-carat coinage, slightly reddish, the color of something old and specific. Lady Liberty striding forward on one face, the eagle with wings spread on the other, the design so crisp on the best examples that she could see individual feathers in the wing detail. 47 of them, each one representing a decision Eleanor had made, a specific dealer, a specific year, a specific amount of money converted from income into a form that would outlast whatever happened afterward. She closed the case carefully and set it back on the shelf and looked at the room for a long time. $1.4 million. But that figure had come from Eleanor's 18-month-old appraisal, and James had told her that Dr. Ruth Salter from the Concord Numismatic Society was coming on Friday. Dr. Salter arrived at 10 in the morning driving a 15-year-old Subaru with a parking permit for the University of New Hampshire on the dash and a magnifying loupe sitting loose in the cup holder. She was 54, with short hair and the kind of direct gaze that came from spending decades examining things at close range and developing opinions about what she saw. She shook Nadia's hand and Marco's hand, without performing warmth, and then asked to see the room. James was present. Marco had asked to stay home from school for this, and Nadia had said yes, understanding that certain things were worth witnessing. Dr. Salter went through the cases methodically. She worked at the desk under the banker's lamp, opening each case and examining each coin in sequence with the loupe, making notes in a small notebook, occasionally setting a coin aside for more extended examination. She did not offer commentary while she worked. She asked one question in the first hour about the storage conditions and for how long, and Nadia answered, and she nodded and went back to her examination. After 2.5 hours, she closed the last case, capped her pen, and set down the loupe. She said, the 18-month-old appraisal was conservative. James said, by how much? The general collection, the Morgans, and the walking liberties and the seated liberty pieces, those are consistent with Eleanor's valuation within normal market variation. Dr. Salter picked up one of the coins she'd set aside, one of the 6 she'd spent the most time with. These 6 are not. The 1907 high-relief double eagle is in condition I would grade MS 63 at minimum, possibly 64. The last recorded sale I'm aware of for a comparable example was $415,000. The kitchen, visible through the open door of the hidden room, was the table where Nadia had sat at 1:14 in the morning packing pot lids into a box. The window where the garden was visible in the gray light. She said, $415,000 for one coin. One coin in that condition, yes. You have 6 exceptional examples and 41 that are in the range Eleanor documented. My revised estimate for the full collection is $820,000 to $910,000, depending on timing and how the market responds to a collection this coherent entering it at once. $910,000 in coins alone. The bonds added another $240,000 at face value plus accrued interest. The house, which a real estate agent named Gary Peabody, whom James had consulted, put at $360,000 in the current market. $1.5 million. $1.5 million, and the house at 114 Camber Street sitting on a lot where Pamela Durst had planned to demolish a building and put up 6 residential units. Marco, who had been standing very still in the doorway of the hidden room during Dr. Salter's summary, said, Mom. She said, I know. Mom, the sunflowers. I know, baby. He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief exactly, but in the way of someone trying to locate the correct category for something that didn't fit the ones he already had. Craig's attorney called Christine Daly on the following Monday with a proposal. The call lasted 11 minutes. Christine called Nadia during her lunch break and described it in the measured tones of someone carrying news that was simultaneously useful and distasteful. Craig was offering a settlement. He would withdraw the will contest if Nadia agreed to transfer the property to the estate, waive any claim to the contents of the hidden room, and accept a cash payment of $75,000 as compensation for her tenancy disruption. The offer was framed as generous. Craig's attorney had apparently used the word generous twice. Nadia sat in her car in the Harwick Medical parking lot and looked at the lunch she hadn't opened and thought about what $75,000 must have seemed like to Craig when he calculated it. Enough to make her say yes. Enough to feel like freedom to someone with $7,400 in credit card debt and a car with 112,000 miles on it. Not enough to feel like a real offer. Not to someone who had read Eleanor's letter 7 times and understood exactly what Eleanor had thought of Craig Holloway. She said to Christine, "No." Christine said, "I thought so. I'll communicate that." What does he do next? He pushes the contest forward. He finds more witnesses. He works the capacity argument harder. Christine paused. He may also get creative about access to the property. We've seen situations where a contesting party files for an emergency protective order claiming estate assets are at risk. It would be a stretch, but it's a move some attorneys make. Can he get one? It's unlikely given the documentation we have, but unlikely is not impossible. If he tries it, we respond immediately, and we bring Dr. Salter's appraisal and Eleanor's video and the signed affidavits of the 2 witnesses. Nadia sat in the parking lot for another minute after she hung up, looking at the bare trees along the edge of the medical center property and thinking about a man she'd met once for 4 minutes who had not looked up from his phone when he shook her hand, and who had been working for 6 months to remove her from a house that Eleanor had spent 60 years preparing to give her. She thought about $75,000 versus $900,000 in coins. She thought about Craig knowing the room existed and not knowing where it was, and being willing to spend whatever his legal fees came to, because if the room turned up in the estate and the 1994 will held, everything in it was his. She thought about Harold spending 40 years keeping this secret from his own nephew, eating dinner with Craig at Christmas probably, making conversation, keeping the room and what was in it, and what Eleanor intended completely out of anything Craig would ever know. 40 years was a long time to keep a secret about a room in your own basement. It suggested a level of certainty about Craig's character that had not softened over 4 decades of family occasions. She went back inside and answered the phone and checked patients in for their appointments and thought about Eleanor working through coin dealers in Boston and New York in the 1970s with her specific eye and her long view and her absolute certainty that the right person would eventually arrive and find the room and not leave. On a Wednesday evening in the 3rd week after Craig filed, Adiz came over again, this time without cookies, and sat at the kitchen table with a look on her face that suggested she had information she'd been thinking about whether to share. She said, "There's something I should tell you about Craig and Harold." Nadia said, "Tell me." Adiz said that in the spring of 2006, the year before Harold died, she had been in Eleanor's garden, helping with some heavy work her knees were no longer managing alone when Craig had come to visit. She'd been introduced briefly and had gone back to her corner of the garden. She'd heard the conversation that happened on the back porch because the kitchen window was open and the porch was 15 feet from where she was working. Craig had asked Harold about the house, about what would happen to it. Harold had said it was Eleanor's house and Eleanor would make her own decisions about it. Craig had asked if Harold had discussed those decisions with Eleanor and Harold had said yes. They had discussed it, and the decision was made and wasn't Craig's concern. Craig had said, "There's money somewhere. Dad always said you and Eleanor were sitting on something." Harold had said, "Your father misremembered." Craig had said, "He didn't misremember. He was very specific." Harold had said, in the voice Adiz described as completely final, the voice of a man closing a subject permanently, "Craig, this house and everything in it belongs to Eleanor and will go where Eleanor decides. There is nothing further to discuss." Did Craig say anything else? Nadia asked. He said he was just thinking about the family's interests. Harold said, "I know exactly what you're thinking about." Harold had died the following year. Eleanor had spent the next 17 years watching Craig watch her, waiting. She had spent those 17 years making sure that what she intended to happen would happen regardless of what Craig did or tried to do or convinced himself he was owed. Nadia sat with this for a long moment. He's known since 2006 that there was something here, she said. He's suspected since before that. But yes. And Eleanor knew he suspected. Eleanor knew everything about the people she was dealing with. That was always true of her. Lena came into the kitchen from the hallway, having finished her homework, and looked at the two of them with the assessment children gave to adult conversations they had interrupted. She said, "Are you talking about Eleanor?" Nadia said, "Yes." Lena sat down at the table with the seriousness of someone joining a meeting she considered herself qualified for. She said, "Can I ask something?" Adiz said, "Of course." Did Eleanor have a lot of friends? Adiz looked at Lena for a moment. She had a few. She was not a person who needed many. Lena thought about this. Was she lonely? I don't think Eleanor experienced loneliness the way most people do, Adiz said, carefully. She was very self-contained. But I think she was glad to have people she trusted nearby. Lena said, "I'm glad we were here." Adiz looked at Nadia and Nadia looked back, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because the 9-year-old at the kitchen table had said the precise right thing without knowing it was the precise right thing. The hearing date arrived in the mail from Hillsborough County Probate Court 3 weeks after Craig filed. A Tuesday in March, 7 weeks away. The hearing would determine whether the will contest had sufficient grounds to proceed to full trial. James explained that this was a preliminary proceeding, that the goal was to present enough documentation to demonstrate that the contest lacked merit and have it dismissed at this stage rather than continuing to a trial that would cost both sides significantly more and take considerably longer. He said if it went to trial, it would take a year or more. He said if they did their job properly in March, it could end there. He said Eleanor's video deposition would be central. He said Dr. Salter's appraisal would be entered as evidence of what was at stake and why Craig had motivation to challenge. He said the timing of Craig's contact with the Hadley Group, the permits applied for, the architectural plans commissioned, all of that formed a pattern he was documenting carefully. He said he was talking to Hadley Group before Eleanor died. Nadia said, "How do you know that?" "Because I have Eleanor's calendar for the last year of her life, and there is a notation for a Thursday in June, 5 months before her death. The notation says Craig, Hadley, be careful." James looked at the folder in front of him. Eleanor kept records. Of course she did. The second phone call from Craig's attorney came at the end of the following week, and it was different from the first one. Garrett Cole's voice carried the particular tightness of someone delivering a message he'd been asked to deliver but didn't find strategically sound. He told Christine that Craig intended to seek a declaration from the court that the coin collection and bearer bonds constituted marital property under Harold Vasquez's estate that had never been properly probated, meaning they had passed to Craig as Harold's heir independently of Eleanor's will. Christine called Nadia to explain this argument and what it meant. It was a long shot. James said so directly when she relayed it to him that evening. Eleanor had purchased the collection with funds from her own professional income, her income, not Harold's, before and during the marriage, and the documentation in the filing cabinet traced every purchase back to those funds. Eleanor had been meticulous in a way that suggested she'd anticipated exactly this argument and had built the paper trail to defeat it. "He's throwing everything at the wall," James said. "Is any of it going to stick?" James was quiet for a moment. "The marital property argument will not succeed with the documentation we have. The capacity argument is weaker than he hopes because of Dr. Cho's records and the video. The undue influence argument is the one he'll press hardest because it's the most difficult to disprove with documents. Character is harder to document than a coin purchase receipt. How do we prove character? We show Eleanor's character. We show her relationships, her habits, her way of making decisions over decades. We show that the Eleanor who named you in her will was the same Eleanor who ran a serious art dealing business for 20 years, who maintained a coin collection with rigorous documentation for 60 years, who kept a calendar notation in June warning herself to be careful about Craig. That person is not someone who got manipulated by a tenant." He paused. "We also show your character. 3 years of receipts. 3 years of communications. Paula Hennessy is willing to testify about what she saw during her 9 years of working for Eleanor. What Eleanor said about you. What Eleanor said about the children. What did Eleanor say? According to Paula, Eleanor said once, and I'm quoting Paula's affidavit directly. The Reyes family takes care of things. That is not nothing. Nadia sat with that for a moment. That is not nothing. Eleanor's highest register of praise, delivered in Eleanor's characteristic idiom, making its way into a legal affidavit that would be presented to a probate court judge in March. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, James, is there anything she didn't plan for? He thought about it genuinely, which she appreciated. She planned for Craig's legal strategies. She planned for the timeline. She planned for you potentially needing immediate legal support, which is why she left my number specifically marked for the time of night you'd most likely be calling. He paused. She didn't plan for you not finding the room. That was the one variable. If you'd left before finding it, the contest would have proceeded without this documentation, without your physical presence in the house, without the coin collection being identified as estate property rather than unknown assets. But I found it. You found it because you went to the basement at 1:48 in the morning to get a box of books and stood in the wrong spot at the wrong time and happened to look at a wall you'd walked past for 3 years. He was quiet for a second. Or perhaps Eleanor would say you found it because you were the kind of person who, when faced with leaving a house you loved, went and stood in the basement instead of the hallway. That you grieved in basements rather than at doors. Nadia looked at the window. Outside, the January dark was complete, the street quiet, the Okafor house lit in the kitchen. She said, she would not have said it that way. No, James agreed. She would have said it more efficiently. James had a copy of the video deposition on a USB drive, and he brought it on a Thursday evening, and they watched it at the kitchen table on Nadia's laptop. He had warned her it was 40 minutes. He had described it as Eleanor being entirely and demonstrably Eleanor. Neither of those things had fully prepared her for the experience of watching Eleanor Vasquez sit in an armchair that Nadia recognized as the one in Eleanor's ground floor living room, the armchair that had faced the garden, and speak directly to a camera in the way Eleanor spoke to everything, without performance, without concession to the conventions of how the moment might be expected to feel. Eleanor had recorded it in July, 6 weeks before the September will was signed, 3 weeks before she died. She wore the charcoal cardigan with the cameo brooch. Her hands were folded in her lap, not rigid, just settled, the way her hands were in the garden when she paused between tasks to think about the next one. The light came through the window behind her, the same south window where she'd been found with the Cather biography. James had conducted the deposition himself, on camera, his voice off to one side. He asked her to state her name and the date and her age. She did, without hesitation, in the order asked. He asked her about her history of the house. She gave it with the precision of someone who organized time as a practical matter rather than a sentimental one. Acquired in 1962. Paid off in 1976. Harold died in 2007. No, Harold was not the original owner. She had been the primary financial contributor to the property throughout their marriage. She explained her dealing career in 3 sentences, each one containing more information than most people conveyed in 3 paragraphs. James asked her about the September will. She described the decisions it contained with the same precision she'd applied to everything else, naming Nadia, naming the reason, describing the assets she was bequeathing with their locations and approximate values as of the previous appraisal. She mentioned Dr. Salter by name as the recommended appraiser. She mentioned James's firm by name as the executor. She mentioned Craig Holloway by name and described the 1994 will and when she had revoked it and the documentation of that revocation that James already had in his files. James asked her, on camera, whether anyone had influenced her decisions about the September will. Eleanor paused for exactly 3 seconds. Not the pause of someone struggling to remember. The pause of someone deciding how precisely to answer a question they found slightly beneath the gravity of the situation. She said, no one influences my decisions. I am 84 years old and have been making consequential decisions since I was 26. I am making this one for reasons I have described and for reasons that are personal and not subject to legal review. I am entirely competent, entirely voluntary, and entirely certain. Nadia paused the video. She sat at the kitchen table for a moment looking at the frozen frame. Eleanor in the armchair with the garden light behind her, the hands folded in her lap. Marco was at the table too, because she'd let him stay up for this. He said, she knew exactly what Craig was going to say. Yes. She planned the whole answer. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She was a lot. Nadia said. She was exactly the right amount. She pressed play, and they watched the remaining 12 minutes of Eleanor describing, with complete precision and no apparent emotion, what she wanted to happen after she died, and why she had chosen the people she had chosen to make it happen. The video ended on Eleanor reaching forward to press stop on the camera, a practical gesture, not dramatic, just the end of a task completed. James, who had already seen this video many times, watched their faces watching it rather than watching the screen. When it ended, he said, "No probate court in New Hampshire is going to look at that and find diminished capacity." Marco said, "No person is going to look at that and find diminished capacity." James permitted himself a small expression that was close to satisfaction. Precisely. Craig's response to the rejection of his settlement offer arrived 10 days later, and it was not what Nadia had expected. She had expected a legal filing, another motion, another layer added to the existing contest. Instead, she received a phone call from her neighbor on the opposite side, a man named Ted Grange who worked from home and was generally attentive to what happened on the street. Ted said that a man he didn't recognize had been parked in a car outside the house for most of that morning, not doing anything, not getting out, just sitting there in a dark sedan, running the engine periodically for heat, watching the house. Nadia called James. James called Christine. Christine called Craig's attorney and informed him that any surveillance of the property or its occupants would be documented and used in the proceedings. The car was gone by early afternoon and did not return, or not in any way that Ted reported. But it had been there. The knowledge that Craig had sent someone to sit outside the house and watch it, to make sure Nadia could see that she was being watched, settled into her understanding of who she was dealing with and what he was capable of when the legal route moved more slowly than he wanted. She told Marco and Lena that evening, directly, because she'd learned in the past 3 years that the worst version of any information was the version they overheard by accident and had to manage alone without context. Lena said, "He had someone watching our house." "Yes, it's not illegal to sit in a car. It was meant to make me uncomfortable." "Did it?" "A little," Nadia said honestly. "But being uncomfortable is not the same as being wrong." Lena processed this with her characteristic deliberateness. "Like when I had to speak in front of the class last month." "Exactly like that. I did it anyway." "You did." Marco said, "We're not moving." "No," Nadia said. "We're not." He nodded once, the way he nodded when a thing had been confirmed that he'd already decided was true but wanted verification for. He'd been doing that since he was about 7. She'd always found it reliable as a read on his internal state. He was not afraid. He was angry on her behalf, which was different, and was keeping the anger at the low regulated temperature he kept everything at. She appreciated this about him more than she'd ever found a good way to say. The story began to spread through Harwick with the particular speed that information moved in small towns, which was faster than anyone who hadn't lived in one would believe and slower than social media, but with more staying power because it traveled through actual conversations between people who knew each other. Adiz mentioned it at her knitting group. Paula Hennessy mentioned it, carefully, to a few people she trusted. The attorney's filing of the will contest was a public record, which meant anyone who went looking at the county courthouse could find Craig Holloway's name and what he was claiming. A woman named Margaret Tierney, who had bought a piece from Eleanor's dealing years in the mid-70s and who still had it on her wall, called James Okafor to ask if there was anything she could do. She was in her 80s and lived in Manchester, but she'd known Eleanor since they were both in their 30s, and she said so clearly and offered to write a statement about Eleanor's character and professional judgment if it would help. James said it would help. Margaret wrote 4 paragraphs about Eleanor that could have been delivered at a memorial service and would instead be delivered to a probate court, which Eleanor would have found more useful and probably preferable. A local historian named Professor William Ashby at Harwick Community College called Christine Daly's office after reading about the coin collection in a brief item in the Harwick Courier, which had picked up the story from the public court filing. He wanted to know if the collection might be appropriate for eventual documentation as a significant example of private numismatic accumulation in New England, and whether the owner would be interested in speaking with him at some point. Christine relayed this to Nadia, who relayed it to Marco, who spent dinner explaining to Lena what a numismatist was. Gary Peabody, the real estate agent, stopped by unannounced on a Saturday to tell Nadia that two developers other than Hadley Group had contacted him about the property once the legal situation became public, and that the number he'd quoted her in January was probably low given current market conditions, and that he wanted her to know this was not him trying to sell her house, but him trying to make sure she had accurate information. She thanked him, and he left, and she stood in the kitchen for a moment and thought about how the same house, the same rooms, the same garden had been worth nothing to Craig's version of the future and was worth whatever it was worth in any version of a future she chose. She went to the window and looked out at the south fence. February was moving slowly toward March the way February always did, as though reluctant to become the month when the thing that would either end this or continue it would happen. The garden was still frozen, still gray under the winter sky, still showing nothing of what was sleeping there. But on the warmest days, the days that reached 40 degrees and held it for a few hours in the afternoon, Lena went and stood at the fence in her coat and looked at the soil with the patience of someone who understood that the work of the previous August would eventually be visible and was willing to wait for it. Nadia spent a Sunday with the left filing cabinet, the one holding everything she hadn't yet reached. The bottom drawer, which Eleanor's letter had said contained the September will, held a sealed envelope with probate court paperwork she recognized as the document James had already filed. But beside it, in a green folder with no label, she found something she hadn't known to look for. A letter from Harold to Eleanor, undated but written in a hand she recognized as older, less controlled than Eleanor's, the handwriting of someone not naturally given to correspondence making himself do it anyway. I have been thinking about what we talked about regarding Craig. I want to write it down because writing makes me say it once and not keep saying it. Craig is going to be disappointed. That is going to be true no matter what we do. I have known this since he was about 22, and I have found no reason to revise the assessment. The money he expects from us will not make him into a different person than the one he is. Giving it to him would just put more money in the hands of the person he already is. I am telling you this because I know you have wondered if you are being too hard, and I want you to know that I do not think you are being too hard. Give it to whoever deserves it. Tell me when you've decided, and I will be glad. Love, Harold. Eleanor had kept this letter in the filing cabinet in the room Harold had helped her build. She had kept it for 17 years after Harold's death, next to the will that carried out exactly what Harold had said. Nadia read it twice, and then sat for a while in the room under the banker's lamp with the green folder in her hands, and thought about a marriage that had lasted long enough for two people to agree completely on something like this, to agree on it so thoroughly that one of them had written it down and the other had kept the letter for 17 years. She looked at the date on the wall, the hearing 7 weeks away. She looked at the room, the shelves, the cases, the filing cabinets. She thought about Eleanor writing "Be careful" in her June calendar after Craig had gone to meet with Hadley Group. She thought about Eleanor writing "Do not leave the house" in December, 6 months later, addressed to a person she expected to need it. She thought about Lena standing at the south fence in her pajamas in the January cold. 7 weeks. She folded Harold's letter carefully and put it back in the green folder and put the folder back in the bottom drawer where Eleanor had left it, because some things deserved to stay where they'd been kept. She got up and turned off the banker's lamp and went back through the bookcase door into the ordinary basement, the furnace ticking, the jar shelves with their masking tape labels, the tools on the pegboard. She went upstairs to bed. In the morning she went to work and came home and made dinner and helped Lena with her fractions homework and listened to Marco describe his track practice. And the days moved forward the way days did, ordinary in their texture and not ordinary at all in what was underneath. The week before the hearing, James called every evening, not to share news, because there was nothing new to share, but to check in on the state of things, which was his way of making sure Nadia understood she was not doing this alone. He asked specific questions about specific documents. He confirmed the order of witnesses. He told her on Wednesday that the judge assigned to the case was a woman named Patricia Merritt who had been on the Hillsborough County probate bench for 11 years and who had, in James's experience, no patience for legal maneuvers that consumed the court's time without serving the legitimate resolution of genuine disputes. She will see what Craig is doing, he said. My job is to make sure she has everything she needs to act on what she sees. Nadia said, Do you think we're going to win? He paused for exactly one beat. I think Eleanor prepared this case. I am presenting it. Yes, I think we are going to win. The daily routine held through the weeks of waiting because it had to, and because routines, once established, had their own momentum that didn't pause for legal proceedings. She went to work. She came home. She made dinner. She sat with Lena while Lena did her homework and listened to Marco describe his track practice with the specific energy of someone who had found his speed and was beginning to understand what the coach had meant when he said this spring with a particular look. Marco was running the 400 meters. His coach had added him to the spring invitational roster, a meet that drew schools from 4 counties, and Marco had told Nadia about it at dinner in a voice calibrated to sound casual, which was how he told her things he was genuinely excited about. She'd said that's great and meant it in all the ways the phrase contained. Lena had found the first green on the 14th of February. She came inside from the garden with her cheeks red from the cold and her boots still on, standing in the kitchen doorway saying Mom. Mom with the urgency that meant something real rather than something routine. Nadia had gone out with her and crouched down at the south fence and looked at where Lena was pointing. A small pale green curve pushing through the frozen soil. The first inch of a sunflower seedling that had decided February was close enough to spring. Lena said, "They came up." Nadia said, "They came up." They stood at the fence for a moment in the cold, both of them looking at 1 inch of pale green, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else seemed necessary. The day before the hearing, James came to the house in the afternoon and sat with Nadia at the kitchen table for 2 hours. He walked through the sequence of the following day's proceedings with the patience of someone who knew that preparation done twice was preparation done right. He told her who would speak first, what Craig's attorney would argue, which points James would address in response, and in what order. He told her she would be called as a witness and that Craig's attorney's questions were predictable and that her answers should be the truth told plainly, because plain truth was the hardest thing for an opposing attorney to work with. He will try to characterize your relationship with Eleanor as one of dependency, James said. He will suggest that Eleanor needed you in ways that created leverage. Answer what was actually true. Don't elaborate to fill the silence. Don't anticipate where the question is going and answer that version instead of what was asked. Nadia said, "She didn't depend on me." Tell me exactly how you would say that on the stand. Eleanor Vasquez made her own decisions about what she needed and sought it directly. She did not ask me for things she hadn't already decided she wanted. She told me when the flocks needed cutting back, and she told me when the pharmacy was open, and those were approximately the boundaries of what she needed from me. James looked at her for a moment. That is exactly right. Say exactly that. Marco appeared in the kitchen doorway, home from practice, still in his track clothes, and looked at the two of them and understood what was happening and went quietly to the refrigerator and got himself a glass of water and left without being asked to. Nadia noted this the way she noted most things Marco did that demonstrated who he was becoming, without comment, just recording it. She slept badly and woke at 5 and lay in the dark listening to the house. The furnace ran its cycle. The house was quiet in the particular way of houses where people were sleeping, contained and specific, a different quiet from the quiet of empty rooms. She thought about Eleanor in the armchair in July, hands folded, speaking to the camera. She thought about do not leave the house. She got up at 5:45 and made coffee and drank it at the kitchen table in the dark before the light came, the way Eleanor had started mornings in this house for 60 years. Marco came down at 6:30 and said nothing for the first few minutes, just poured his own coffee and sat across from her. He had grown, over the winter, in a way that had become visible in his face rather than just his height, some quality of settled attention that had arrived sometime in the past few months and showed no sign of leaving. He looked like someone who had thought about things and arrived at positions he was prepared to hold. He said, "You're going to be fine." She said, "I know. I mean it. James is good at this." Eleanor made sure of everything. "You're going to be fine." "I know," she said again. And it was true, the knowing underneath the nervousness, the knowledge that Eleanor had not left this to chance, and that James had spent 31 years being exactly the person Eleanor would have hired to not leave it to chance. She wore a dark gray blazer and the black trousers she wore to Harwick Medical for formal meetings with insurance representatives. She had polished her shoes. She had done her hair the way she did it for work rather than for Saturday mornings in the garden. And when she looked at herself in the bathroom mirror, she thought she looked like someone who had come to a courthouse with the intention of being taken seriously, which was exactly right. Marco and Lena went to school. Marco squeezed her shoulder on his way out the door, a brief, deliberate gesture, and Lena hugged her for a moment longer than usual before letting go and walking down the porch steps toward the sidewalk. Nadia watched them from the door and then went inside and got her coat and her folder of documents and drove to Hillsborough County Probate Court. The parking lot held a modest number of cars on a Tuesday morning in March. The courthouse itself was a three-story brick building that had been built in the 1940s and maintained with the particular grimness of public architecture, functional and unhurried. Inside, the hallways smelled of institutional heating and old wood and the particular industrial cleaning product that courthouses and hospitals and schools used in common, as though civic life required a specific smell to establish its own seriousness. James was waiting in the hallway outside Courtroom 3. He had his briefcase and a cardboard box of documents and his navy overcoat. He looked as he always looked, prepared and calibrated, unhurried without being casual. He shook her hand and told her Judge Merritt ran on time and that they would be called in at 9 sharp. Craig was already inside the courtroom when they entered. He was sitting at the table on the left side of the aisle with Garrett Cole, who had an open laptop and several folders arranged before him. Craig looked up when Nadia and James came in and then looked away again, back at whatever Cole was showing him on the screen. He wore a charcoal suit. His hair was the same precise gray. He looked like what he was, a man who had made a calculation about the odds and still believed the calculation was correct. Adiz Okafor was in the gallery. Nadia had not asked her to come. She had come on her own, dressed in a deep purple coat with her reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she nodded once when Nadia sat down at the right side table, and Nadia nodded back. James leaned over and said quietly, "There are 2 other people you might recognize in the back row." She turned. Paula Hennessy, Eleanor's housekeeper, sat in the second row wearing her winter coat and her expression of someone who had come to say something and intended to be clear about it. Beside her, a woman in her 80s whom Nadia didn't recognize, but who turned out to be Margaret Tierney, who had driven from Manchester that morning to be present at the hearing of a woman she had known for 50 years, even though her written statement was already in James's folder and her presence wasn't required. She had come because Eleanor had mattered to her, and because being present when things mattered was what you did. Judge Patricia Merritt entered at 9 o'clock exactly, which was what James had predicted. She was in her mid-50s, practical-looking, with short hair and an efficiency of movement that suggested she organized time carefully and expected others to do the same. She settled into her chair, reviewed something on the bench in front of her without expression, and then looked up and addressed the courtroom with the flat authority of someone who had been doing this for 11 years and had no interest in proceedings that went longer than necessary. She said, "We're here on the matter of Holloway versus the Vasquez estate, a contest of the will dated September 14th of last year filed by Craig Holloway against the named beneficiary Nadia Reyes. Counsel for the contestant will present first. Mr. Cole, please proceed." Garrett Cole stood. He was a capable attorney in the way that adequately paid attorneys were capable, competent, and prepared, and without the specific quality that made some lawyers memorable. He had spent the winter assembling the best case available to him from the materials Craig had provided, and the best case available to him from those materials was not strong, which he appeared to understand and was proceeding with anyway. He presented the capacity argument first. He described Eleanor's age at the time of the September will signing, 84. He described the statistical likelihood of cognitive decline at that age, citing general medical literature in the vague way that suggested he'd had someone look it up rather than read it himself. He called his medical witness. Dr. Gerald Finn was a physician at a walk-in clinic in Manchester. He had seen Eleanor Vasquez on October 19th of the previous year for a respiratory infection, acute sinusitis, which he had treated with a standard antibiotic prescription. The appointment had lasted 14 minutes. He had not conducted a cognitive assessment. He had not noted any concerns about Eleanor's cognition in his records because the appointment had not been about cognition. He had been asked to review Eleanor's general presentation during that visit and to offer an opinion about whether anything had suggested diminished capacity. He offered the opinion that, in a 14-minute appointment for a sinus infection 14 months before the will was signed, he had not observed any definitive signs of cognitive impairment but could not rule out its presence or absence. Judge Merritt said, "Dr. Finn, You're testifying that in a 14-minute appointment for a sinus infection, you cannot rule in or out the cognitive status of a patient. Dr. Finn said that was correct. Judge Merritt made a note. Her expression did not change. Cole moved to the undue influence argument. He described the tenant-landlord relationship in terms that he'd clearly practiced, dwelling on the power differential of a young woman with financial needs living in the home of a wealthy, elderly woman. He used the phrase isolated and dependent twice, apparently having decided this was the characterization most likely to be useful. He said that Nadia Reyes had occupied a position of unusual proximity to Eleanor Vasquez in the final years of Eleanor's life, that she had access to Eleanor's home, that she was present in ways that other people were not, and that the circumstances of her being named as the primary beneficiary of an estate worth in excess of $1.4 million warranted the court's scrutiny. He entered the 1994 will as Exhibit A. James rose and said he would address the 1994 will's legal status shortly and asked the court's permission to do so after Cole concluded his opening. Judge Merritt said proceed. Cole finished by noting that Craig Holloway was Eleanor's surviving family member. That family intention had been clearly established by the 1994 document, and that the September will had been executed by a woman of advanced age under circumstances that deserved examination. He sat down. James stood. He was unhurried in the way of someone with more material than he needed and the confidence that came from that. He set 2 folders on the podium and did not open either of them immediately. He said, "Your Honor, the contestant has presented a physician who saw the decedent once for 14 minutes for a sinus infection and cannot rule in or out her cognitive status at any point in her life. I want to contrast that with what I am about to present, because the contrast is the central fact of this proceeding." He played Eleanor's video. 40 minutes of Eleanor Vasquez sitting in the armchair by the south window, hands folded, speaking. The courtroom was quiet in a way that courtrooms were sometimes quiet when something occurred that superseded procedural rhythm, not the quiet of compliance, but the quiet of attention. Eleanor named the date, her age, the location, the people present. She described the assets she was bequeathing with their locations and approximate values. She named Dr. Salter as the recommended appraiser. She named James's firm as the executor. She described the 1994 will and when and why she had revoked it. She described the revocation she had executed in 2007 with the specific legal language that showed she understood exactly what she was doing and had been doing so for 17 years. Then she said, in response to James's on-camera question about whether anyone had influenced her decisions, the words that Nadia had heard 7 times already and that sounded different in a courtroom than they sounded in a kitchen. "No one influences my decisions. I am 84 years old and have been making consequential decisions since I was 26. I am making this one for reasons I have described and for reasons that are personal and not subject to legal review. I am entirely competent, entirely voluntary, and entirely certain." Judge Merritt watched the video without expression, which was no different from how she watched everything. But when it ended, she wrote something in her notes that took longer than the notes she had taken during Cole's presentation. James called Dr. Miriam Cho. Dr. Cho was 61, Eleanor's physician for 12 years, and she took the stand with the manner of someone accustomed to courtrooms because her specialty occasionally required them. She described Eleanor's health history in the context of cognitive function. She described the appointment 3 weeks before the September will was signed. She said Eleanor's mini-mental state examination score at that appointment was 29 out of 30, which she described for the court as within the range typically characterized as normal. She said she had observed no signs of cognitive impairment in 12 years of treating Eleanor Vasquez, and that Eleanor had been among the most cognitively engaged patients she had seen at any age. Cole cross-examined. He asked whether it was possible for a patient to present well during a medical appointment and still experience cognitive challenges in daily life. Dr. Cho said yes, that was possible. He asked whether she had observed Eleanor in her home environment in ways that would allow assessment of daily function. Dr. Cho said she had not, but that the MMSE was designed to assess exactly the kind of daily cognitive function he was describing, and that Eleanor's score was consistent with no impairment. He asked whether she was prepared to state definitively that Eleanor had been free of any impairment at the time of the September signing. Dr. Cho said, I am prepared to state that in my 12 years of treating Eleanor Vasquez, I observed no cognitive impairment, that the assessment conducted 3 weeks before the will was signed showed a score consistent with normal function, and that the video I just watched is consistent with everything I observed in 12 years of appointments. If you'd like a more definitive statement than that, I'm not sure what it would look like or why it would be credible. Judge Merritt wrote something that took several seconds. James called Paula Hennessy. Paula was 52, had worked for Eleanor for 9 years, and had the manner of someone who was going to say what she knew and not pretend to know what she didn't. She described Eleanor's daily routines as she had observed them. She described Eleanor's mental engagement, her reading, her correspondence, her garden management, her careful maintenance of records. She described Eleanor's relationship with Nadia in specific terms, because James had asked her to be specific. Eleanor told me once that the Reyes family took care of things, Paula said. She said it about all 3 of them, the mother and the kids. She said it in the way she said things that she decided were true and didn't need to be said twice. Cole asked Paula whether Eleanor had ever expressed affection for Nadia Reyes. Paula said, Eleanor Vasquez didn't express affection the way most people do, but she noticed when people did things right, and she said so. With Mrs. Reyes, she mentioned specific things. The garden. The children. I didn't keep a list, but I remember them because Eleanor was specific and you remember specific things. Did Eleanor ever tell you she intended to leave her estate to Mrs. Reyes? She told me she had made arrangements for the house that she was satisfied with. That's all she said. Eleanor didn't explain herself unless she chose to. James said he had several documents to enter as evidence and asked the court's permission to do so in sequence. The first was the coin collection appraisal from Dr. Ruth Salter, which he entered to establish the value of the estate and, by extension, Craig's financial motive for contesting. The number of $910,000, attached to a document signed by a numismatic expert with 30 years of credentials, occupied a specific amount of space in the courtroom. Craig's face did not change. His attorney shuffled papers. The second was the September will itself, with the witness signatures of Paula Hennessy and Dr. Miriam Cho and the notarization by a New Hampshire notary public whose credentials James had verified and included. The third was the revocation document for the 1994 will, signed by Eleanor in 2007, properly executed, entered into the record at the time. Judge Merritt looked at Cole. Mr. Cole, the revocation document, your client's primary exhibit, is premised on the continued validity of the 1994 will was executed and recorded in 2007. I assume your position addresses this. Cole said that the validity of the revocation was itself subject to questions about Eleanor's intentions and the circumstances under which it was executed. Judge Merritt looked at him for a moment. A properly executed legal document entered into the public record 17 years ago, with no previous challenge filed by your client or anyone else, is subject to challenge now on grounds you haven't presented this morning. Is that where we are? Cole said that he was laying the groundwork for arguments he would develop further in a full trial proceeding. Judge Merritt wrote something. James said, Your Honor, I have one more document to enter, and I want to be clear about its provenance. He placed it on the podium. This is a copy of a letter written by Eleanor Vasquez to my office in August of 2001. The original was in my client files. The copy was in Eleanor's personal files in her home, in the hidden room that is the subject of the estate's asset inventory. I am entering both. He read the relevant section aloud. Eleanor had written, in 2001, 13 years before the formal revocation, in the precise handwriting that everyone in the courtroom had now seen on a screen for 40 minutes. I want to formally document my intention to revoke the will I signed in 1994. I have never been comfortable with that document, and I should have addressed it sooner. The circumstances under which it was signed included the presence of Harold's brother, who attended what I had understood to be a private appointment with my attorney, and whose interest in the provisions of the document I found troubling at the time. I did not act on that discomfort immediately. I am acting on it now. Please advise me on the correct procedure for formal revocation. The letter documented, in Eleanor's own hand and dated 13 years before the formal revocation, that the 1994 will had not represented her true wishes from close to its inception. That Craig's father had been present at the signing in ways Eleanor had found troubling. That Eleanor had wanted it revoked since 2001 and had formally revoked it in 2007 and had then, for good measure, signed an entirely new will in September of last year to ensure there was no ambiguity about where she stood. Cole said, "Objection, Your Honor. The relevance of a private letter from 2001 to the question of capacity in the September document is unclear." Judge Merritt said, "The relevance is to the question of the contestant's good faith basis for asserting that the 1994 will represents Eleanor Vasquez's true testamentary wishes, Mr. Cole. A document the decedent wanted revoked for 23 years and formally revoked in 2007 is a thin premise for a will contest. I'll hear Mr. Okafor finish." James entered the letter and said he had one more item. He placed a printed document on the table, a copy of a public filing from Harwick County Planning and Zoning. The Hadley Group had filed a preliminary development inquiry for the property at 114 Camber Street on June 17th of the previous year, 5 months before Eleanor died. James said, "Eleanor Vasquez's personal calendar for the previous year contains a notation on June 20th. I am entering a copy of that calendar page." He read it. "Craig, Hadley, be careful." 3 days after Hadley Group filed a preliminary inquiry with the County Planning Board, for which they would have needed, at minimum, a representation from a property owner or prospective owner that the property was available for development. The courtroom was quiet. Cole said, "Your Honor, my client had legitimate business discussions with multiple parties and this document does not establish," Judge Merritt said. "Mr. Cole, I am going to ask Mr. Okafor to call his next witness before I have questions for you." James called Nadia. She had been watching the proceedings from the right side table and had spent the morning doing what James had told her to do, which was listen and note and not react to things that were designed to provoke a reaction. She had sat still through Cole's description of her as someone in a position to manipulate an isolated elderly woman. She had sat still through the characterization of her financial circumstances as a factor in her alleged motive. She had sat still and noted these things and told herself they were words arranged in a certain order by a man being paid to arrange words in that order, and that words arranged by other people to describe her had never accurately described her yet. She stood and went to the witness stand. James asked her to describe her tenancy at 114 Camber Street in her own words. She did, clearly and without elaboration, 3 years, the rent, the garden, the children's schools nearby, the Saturday mornings, the things Eleanor had said. She mentioned the books Marco borrowed. She mentioned the trowel Eleanor had given Lena. James asked her to describe Eleanor's mental state as she had observed it over 3 years. She said, "Eleanor Vasquez was the most precise person I have ever known. She remembered everything she had told me. She knew the name and condition of every plant in that garden. She gave my daughter a 20-minute explanation of how a bulb planter worked when Lena was 7 years old, and it was the most thorough explanation I have ever heard of anything. She corrected my pruning technique once and never mentioned it again because she had said it once and assumed that was sufficient." Judge Merritt, without looking up from her notes, said, "Counsel, continue." James asked her to describe the morning of January 14th, the discovery, the letter, the call to his office. She described it. The basement at 1:48 in the morning. The bookcase. The scratch on the floor. The door. The room. The envelope with her name. She described Eleanor's letter. She described the coins in their cases and the filing cabinets and the banker's lamp on the desk. James asked her whether she had ever asked Eleanor to change her will or leave her anything. She said no. He asked whether Eleanor had ever discussed her estate plans with her. She said no, not once in 3 years. He asked whether she had known the hidden room existed before January 14th. She said no. He asked how she had found it. She said, "I went to the basement to get a box of books and stood in the wrong spot at the wrong time and looked at a wall I'd walked past for 3 years." Cole cross-examined. He asked about her financial situation at the time of Eleanor's death, whether she had debts, whether she had been facing the prospect of finding more expensive housing. She answered yes to both. He asked whether the prospect of inheriting valuable property would have been financially significant to her. She said yes, obviously. He asked whether she had ever discussed her financial situation with Eleanor. She said, once. In the first year of my tenancy. Eleanor asked me directly whether the rent was manageable, and I said it was, barely. She said nothing further about it. Cole asked whether Eleanor had expressed sympathy about her financial situation. Nadia looked at him for a moment. Eleanor Vasquez did not express sympathy as a category of response. She expressed observations. She observed that I worked 2 jobs. She observed that I managed well enough. Cole said, "Isn't it possible that Eleanor's desire to help you financially influenced the decisions she made about her estate?" "No." He paused. "You're very certain?" Eleanor's decisions were not influenced by desire to help people. They were informed by her assessment of what was correct. She didn't give me the house because she wanted to help me. She gave me the house because she had decided I was the right person to have it. Those are different things. Cole looked at his notes. He asked one more question. "Mrs. Reyes, you've testified that you found the room by chance. Is it possible Eleanor intended for you to find it?" Nadia said, "She left a letter with my name on it." "Yes." "Isn't that curious? If Eleanor wanted you to have the estate, why not simply tell you?" "Because she was Eleanor Vasquez and she arranged things the way she arranged things." Nadia looked at Cole steadily. "She left me the letter in the room. She gave James instructions to wait for my call. She made the video. She kept records for 60 years. Everything was arranged. She just didn't tell me about the room in advance, probably because telling me in advance would have changed what the room meant." Cole sat down. Judge Merritt said, "Redirect, Mr. Okafor?" James said, "One question, Your Honor." He looked at Nadia. "Mrs. Reyes, on the morning of January 14th, before you found the room and before you called my office, were you in the process of vacating the property?" She said, "Yes. I had boxes packed. I had a truck outside. I had 4 hours until the deadline. I was in the basement getting a box of books I needed to load." "Were you looking for the room?" "No." "Were you looking for anything Eleanor might have left you?" "No. I was getting a box of books." James said, "Nothing further." Judge Merritt said, "Thank you, Mrs. Reyes. You may step down." She returned to her seat. James sat beside her and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do. Judge Merritt reviewed her notes for slightly longer than felt comfortable. The courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms were quiet when people were waiting for something that mattered to be said aloud. Then she said, "I'm going to address the capacity argument first, because I think it's the most straightforward of the 3. The contestant has presented one physician who saw the decedent for 14 minutes for a sinus infection and cannot make any determination about her cognitive status at any point in her life. The respondent has presented 12 years of records from the decedent's treating physician and a 40-minute video recorded 6 weeks before the September will was signed in which Eleanor Vasquez demonstrates verbal recall, reasoning, legal comprehension, and self-awareness that is, frankly, not typical of any age." She paused. "The capacity argument does not meet the preponderance standard. I am dismissing it." She looked at her notes again. "The undue influence argument is more textured. Undue influence requires showing that the decedent was susceptible to influence, that the influencer had the opportunity to exert it, that there was a disposition to exercise that influence for an improper purpose, and that the result reflected that influence. The contestant has shown that Mrs. Reyes was Eleanor Vasquez's tenant and had proximity to her. He has not shown susceptibility, disposition, or a result that reflects anything other than Eleanor Vasquez's consistent and documented intentions." She looked at Garrett Cole. "Mr. Cole, a woman who wrote to her attorney in 2001 that she wanted her 1994 will revoked, and who formally revoked it in 2007, and who made a 40-minute video explaining her estate decisions in July, was not susceptible to influence. She was, if anything, the opposite of susceptible." Cole said, "Your Honor, we believe that in a full trial proceeding we would be able to develop," Judge Merritt said. "Mr. Cole, the standard for proceeding to full trial is whether the contest has merit sufficient to warrant the court's continued involvement and the parties' continued expenditure of resources. Based on what I have seen this morning, this contest does not meet that standard." She set down her pen. "I am dismissing the will contest in its entirety. The September will is valid. The named beneficiary is Nadia Reyes. Mr. Okafor, I assume you have the paperwork to proceed with estate settlement." James said, "Already prepared, Your Honor." Judge Merritt said, "Then we're done here. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down at 11:43. Craig sat at his table for a moment without moving. Then he said something to Garrett Cole, short and low. and Cole responded with what appeared to be an explanation that Craig did not receive well. And then Craig stood and put on his coat and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Nadia. He did not look at her. Adiz was there when Nadia turned from the table, already on her feet in the gallery, and she shook Nadia's hand with both of hers and said Eleanor's name once, very quietly, in a way that was not an address to anyone present and not quite a prayer either, just acknowledgement, just the saying of a name as a way of marking that something had happened that she should know about. Paula Hennessy was crying, which she appeared to find embarrassing, and she shook Nadia's hand and said she was sorry she was being ridiculous, and Nadia said she wasn't being ridiculous at all. Margaret Tierney, in her 80s and in from Manchester, waited until the others had spoken and then said, Eleanor was right about you. She usually was right. She left before Nadia could respond. James said, I'll file the settlement documents this afternoon. The estate will formally transfer within 60 days, possibly fewer. She said, James. He said, yes. She said, thank you. He said, thank Eleanor. She drove home in the March light, which was still pale and thin but had more of the quality of real light than January had managed, the sky showing a faint blue beyond the overcast rather than just gray all the way down. She parked in front of the house and sat in the car for a minute looking at the front of it. The porch wrapping around 3 sides, the cream-colored paint, the dark green shutters, the garden visible on the south side, the south fence, and if she looked carefully, she could see from here the faint green of what Lena had found on Valentine's Day. She went inside and stood in the kitchen and called Rosa. Rosa picked up on the second ring and said, how did it go? Nadia said, we won. Rosa said, oh, thank God, in the tone of someone who had been holding this particular breath for months and had just been permitted to exhale. She called Marco's school and left a message with the front office that he could relay to Marco through whatever the school system was, knowing it would reach him before he got home. She texted Lena's teacher because Lena's school had a parent contact system and she wanted Lena to know before the end of the school day. She made tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the kitchen that was going to be her kitchen. Craig filed no further challenges. His attorney sent a formal letter of withdrawal to James's office 8 days after the hearing, the language indicating that Craig Holloway would not be pursuing additional legal remedies. James described this as standard, that after a dismissal of this kind, the practical cost-benefit calculation no longer supported continuation. He said it the way he said most things, matter-of-factly, and Nadia understood that the matter-of-fact tone was a deliberate choice, that James knew as well as anyone that something more than a practical calculation had occurred. Pamela Durst did not call again. Hadley Group withdrew the preliminary inquiry from the County Planning Board's active files. A representative from a different development company sent a letter in April expressing interest in the property should Nadia ever decide to sell, which Nadia read and filed and did not respond to. The estate settled on a Thursday in May, 61 days after the hearing. James called to tell her, and the call lasted about 3 minutes, which was appropriate because the information was simple. The house was hers. The coin collection was hers. The bearer bonds were hers. The filing cabinets and their contents were hers. The desk and the banker's lamp were hers. The hidden room was hers, and so was the ordinary basement, and so was the kitchen with the herbs above the window that she had taken down in January and put back on their hooks in the dark hours before James arrived, before any of it had been resolved. She had already paid off the credit card debt in April, $7,400 gone in one transfer from the account James had set up for estate administration, a transfer that took 30 seconds to execute, and which represented 14 months of minimum payments and the particular weight of debt carried by people who could not afford to carry debt. She'd sat looking at the zero balance on the screen for a longer time than the information required. She had put a month's worth of both salaries and savings instead of spending them. She had scheduled the car for service at a shop on Route 11 and had told the mechanic to do everything it needed rather than the minimum necessary to keep it running, and the bill had been $812, and she had paid it without doing math first. This was new. This was what it felt like to not do math first. Marco ran the Spring Invitational on a Friday in May, 2 weeks after the estate settled. Nadia took the day off from Harwick Medical, the first full day off she'd taken since the previous November, and sat in the bleachers with Adiz, who had come because Marco had told her about it, and she had decided that was sufficient invitation. Lena was there with a sign she'd made at home using markers and the back of a cereal box that said Marco 400M in letters that got progressively larger as she ran out of planning room for the spacing. Marco ran the 400 meters in 53.8 seconds, which was his personal best by nearly a full second, and which his coach received with the contained satisfaction of someone whose predictions had been accurate. He placed second overall in his age division, behind a junior from a school in Concord who had been running since age 10 and who Marco shook hands with after the race with the manner of someone who respected a genuine result. He found Nadia in the bleachers afterward and she hugged him, and he let her, which at 14 he did not always do in public. He said, 53.8. She said, I know. I was watching. He said, Coach thinks under 52 by fall if I work the curve. She said, then you work the curve. He grinned, which was rare enough to be worth noticing. Yeah. They drove home with Lena in the back reading a book about succulents she'd gotten from the library and Adiz riding along, because Nadia had offered and Adiz had accepted with the simplicity of someone who had stopped pretending she didn't want company. The afternoon light came through the car windows in the long slanted way of May in New Hampshire. The trees finally leafed out, the roadsides green after months of bare branches. Lena said from the back seat, without looking up from the book, the sunflowers are going to be tall this year. I planted closer to the fence than last time, and they'll have more support. Nadia said, how do you know that? Eleanor told me. The fence wire counts as a trellis even though it's not exactly one. When did Eleanor tell you that? Lena looked up. Last summer. Before she died. We were in the garden and she was showing me the spacing. She returned to the book. I remembered. Adiz, in the passenger seat, said nothing. Nadia looked at the road. The sunflowers came up in July. They came up later than Lena had hoped, because June had been cold and wet in the particular New Hampshire way that June sometimes was, gray and patient and unhurried, but they came up. By the third week of July the stalks were knee-high and rising, and by the first week of August they had reached 6 feet along the south fence, the golden heads turning through the day to follow the light, which was what sunflowers did if you planted them where the light was right. Lena had gotten that part right. Nadia was in the garden on a Saturday morning in August when Marco came out with 2 mugs of coffee, which he'd learned to make properly over the winter, and handed her one and stood beside her looking at the south fence. It was early enough that the dew was still on the grass and the light was the specific pale gold of summer mornings before the heat built, and the sunflowers were doing what they did, the heads already turned toward the east to catch the morning. Marco said, I've been thinking about something. She said, what? Eleanor planted this garden in, what, the 60s. And she kept it for 60 years. And now Lena's going to keep it. She might. She's going to. You know she is. He drank his coffee. I was thinking about how long that is. 60 years plus whatever Lena does. That's a long time for something to just keep going. Nadia looked at the sunflowers. She thought about Eleanor in the armchair in July, entirely certain, explaining decisions she had made for reasons that were personal and not subject to legal review. She thought about Harold writing, tell me when you've decided, and I will be glad. She thought about the room with the banker's lamp and the cherrywood cases and the 60 years of receipts in the filing cabinet, each one with its note in the margin, each one an act of patience done in the certainty that patience was the correct approach. She thought about a library bulletin board in November and a cream note card with careful handwriting and a rent that never changed for 3 years because Eleanor had made a decision and saw no reason to revisit it. She said, a long time is how things last. Marco thought about this for a moment. Is that from Eleanor? It's from something she showed me. The way she built things. The way she kept things. You do it long enough and the right way, and it just keeps going after you. He nodded once, the long considering nod. Then he said, I'm going to run again this afternoon. The curve work. She said, go. He went inside, and she stood in the garden with her coffee and the morning light and the sunflowers that had not been there in January, that had been waiting in the frozen ground while a woman in a kitchen was packing pot lids into a cardboard box at 1:14 in the morning with 4 hours until a deadline she was not going to meet. She thought about that woman sometimes. The person she'd been at 1:14 in the morning who had gone to the basement for a box of books and stood in the wrong place at the wrong time and looked at a wall she'd walked past for 3 years, who had found a door behind a bookcase and a room that smelled of paper and aged silver and a white envelope on a desk with her name on it. She did not think of her as a different person, exactly. But she thought about what it had taken to be that person, the 2 jobs, and the $7,400 in the car with 112,000 miles and the custody of the math she did in her head every month to make the numbers hold. She thought about what it had taken to stand in that basement at 1:48 in the morning and look at a wall carefully enough to notice a scratch on the concrete. Eleanor had written, "Do not leave the house." Eleanor had not written, "You will find the room." She had not written, "The scratch is at the base of the bookcase." She had not written, "Press the board on the upper shelf." She had written only those 4 words, addressed to a specific person, trusting that the specific person would be the kind of person who, when standing in a basement at 1:48 in the morning with everything else going wrong, would stand still long enough to look at something she'd always walked past. She was that person. She had not known she was that person until Eleanor had known it first. There was a morning later in August when Lena came to find her in the hidden room. Nadia had been down there going through the last folder in the left filing cabinet, the one she hadn't yet reached, reading Eleanor's records the way she'd been reading them all spring and summer, an hour at a time in the evenings or on weekend mornings, absorbing 60 years of careful work the way you absorbed something that needed time to be understood. Lena stood in the doorway in the particular way she had, one hand on the doorframe, assessing the room and its contents with the gardener's attention she brought to spaces where things were kept and tended. She said, "Can I come in?" Nadia said, "Yes." Lena came in and stood by the shelf with the cases and ran one finger along the edge of the cherry wood in the way she ran her fingers along the tops of books, a habit she'd had since she was small. She looked at the filing cabinets. She looked at the desk with the banker's lamp, which Nadia had plugged into the extension cord and used every time she came down here. She said, "Did Eleanor spend a lot of time in this room?" "I think so. Yes. It feels like someone's room. A room someone was in a lot. A room someone cared about." Lena thought about this, then sat down on the floor the way children sat on floors, legs crossed, comfortable, without deliberate arrangement. She looked at the coin cases. "Are we going to sell them?" Nadia said, "Some of them. James is advising us on timing." "What about the most special ones?" "Those we keep." Lena said, "Good." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to learn about them. The coins. What makes one worth more than another?" "That's a good thing to learn. Maybe I could find books. Marco could probably find you something in those shelves upstairs." Lena smiled, which was different from her other expressions, wider and more sudden, the smile of someone who hadn't been expecting to smile and had been ambushed by it. "He'll probably already know exactly which ones." "He probably will." They sat in the hidden room in the quiet of a Saturday morning, the extension cord running under the door to the banker's lamp, the green shade casting its focused light. The cases on the shelves. The filing cabinets. The room Eleanor had built with Harold in 1969 and maintained for 55 years and left to a family she had observed for 3 years with the precise attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. Lena said, "I want to show this room to Mrs. Coleman. From school. For a project I'm doing on preservation." "What's the project about?" "Things that last." "What makes things last?" She looked at the room. "I think this room is a good example." Nadia looked at her daughter on the floor of Eleanor Vasquez's hidden room on a morning in August when the sunflowers were 6 feet tall along the south fence and the light was coming through the regular basement ceiling in the way that summer light came through things, finding angles it hadn't found in winter. She thought about things that lasted. The specific arithmetic of it, what patience cost, and what it produced, what it meant to do something correctly over a long enough time that it became something that outlasted the person who built it. She thought about Harold's letter in the green folder. "Tell me when you've decided, and I will be glad." She thought about Eleanor writing, in the letter she'd read 7 times now, and would read more. "Your daughter Lena planted sunflowers last summer along the south fence and paid attention to where the light fell in the morning." Eleanor had been dead for a year. The room was here. The cases were here. The filing cabinets with their 60 years of careful record were here. The letter was in the top drawer of Nadia's bedside table, where she had moved it from her back pocket the night she found it, and it would stay there. The house at 114 Camber Street was 2 years away from being 120 years old, which was old enough to have seen several versions of the neighborhood around it come and go, old enough to have outlasted most of the plans people had made about it. Old enough to have become one of those things that lasted not because luck had been involved, but because someone had paid attention and kept paying attention and had trusted that the right person would eventually do the same. Nadia Reyes was the right person. She had known this about herself since January and had been learning, month by month, what it meant. Lena was 9 years old and had planted sunflowers in the right place, and they had come up, and she had already started planning where she would plant them next year, whether to extend the row along the fence or try a second row behind the first, and whether the second row would get enough light or would be shaded by the front one. She was thinking about it the way Eleanor had thought about everything, in terms of what the specific place required and what would work and what she would do differently next time. Nadia looked at her daughter and thought, there it is. The thing that lasts. Not the room and not the coins and not the house, though she would keep all of those. The thing that lasted was this: a person paying attention in a specific garden on a specific morning to where the light fell, and planning for next year with the knowledge that next year would come. Eleanor had known it. She had written it down. The lamp made its pool of warm light on the desk in the room that smelled of old paper and aged silver and the particular clean dryness of a space that had been kept carefully for a very long time. The sunflowers were 6 feet tall along the south fence. Nadia Reyes was home. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.